I'm joined by Shruggy and Jelma Bayorn once again.
Hello, Internet.
Hello, good people.
They're not good. So we are looking at a video called The Naturalist Nuke by King Crocoduck. And it's going to be a lot of fun.
Okay, so I'm going into this blind. Well, not blind. I skimmed a few.
We are all going into this blind, so this is our raw, real-time, real-deal reactions.
I'm technically going into this not blind, but I've forgotten most of it because it's terrible. So we'll just go through it and comment and stuff. This isn't going to be the definitive statement on this video. I am going to be making a response in essay form in video essay form once the all three of his episodes are out. I think we're just looking at the first episode today. We'll see how long that takes. If it takes us not a lot of time, then we'll skip to the next one. But yeah, that's what's happening. So without further ado, let's get into it.
This video series will put forward my positive argument for why I believe science, at its core, is not a social construct. This is in contrast to the negative arguments that I offered 3 years ago in my video, Is Science a Social Construct?, wherein I merely pointed out why I find social constructionist arguments about the nature of scientific inquiry to be deeply unconvincing. Okay,
so just before we get right into it, so there's two things. This is sort of patently absurd on its face. There are a lot of things that there's questions about whether or not like it is a social construct or is it natural, but science is something that is patently, obviously a socially constructed thing. It's not permanent throughout human history. My question here is to you guys, because maybe you can elaborate on this in a more useful way than I can. What are the stakes here exactly? Like, what do you think is his reason for wanting to propose that science is not a social construct?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah. Sure, I'll open it. I mean, again, like there's specific points of tension in his argument that kind of reveal this, but in general, I think it's based on a misunderstanding of social construction and nominalism more generally as being this kind of arbitrary naming of phenomena that exceed our capacity to name them. So in other words, he doesn't want philosophers just making shit up bluntly. And he doesn't want people not tracking what's going on in reality, in the world, in a way that we can verify and use that isn't influenced by bias or judgment. So a lot of scientists, and rightly so, are people who are, how do I put it, positively disposed to scientific inquiry. And as someone who works sort of broadly in philosophy of science, I'm one of those people, want to make sure they try to take bias, judgment, framing, naming, etc., out of the process as much as possible. Now, the way you increase accuracy is by assuming that this is inevitable, not by assuming that this is something that we can do without. And in fact, usually what people find is the more they assume they can do without this process of, being biased or putting front-end judgments in or arbitrariness in naming, the more arbitrary and the more biased they become. So it's sort of I think it's a good faith miscalculation about what leads to robust and careful descriptive inquiry. And it's based on a misunderstanding of what social construction is.
Yeah. Should I say a thing?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, okay, so I kind of don't understand the question. Is science a social construct? I mean, what does he mean by social construct? I feel like, so, Sunday you opened by saying, well, it's obviously a social construct, but I mean, that's not obvious to me because I don't understand it. I mean, science might be a kind of, it's a social activity of a certain kind. It's an epistemic social activity. What does it mean to say that it's a construct? I mean, it's a thing out there in the world. You can point to institutions which are dedicated to fostering that, funding it, producing lab equipment for it. You can look at the practice of individual scientists. You can look at professional associations. Those are all things, and they're all social communities. So I mean, but yeah, I don't know. And now I hear myself double.
I think generally the point that's being made when somebody says, in a non-polemical sense, that something is a social construct, is that its existence is predicated on some kind of social factor in particular.
That's right.
So it might be, for example, like a historical trajectory that makes some concept thinkable, maybe. So like, for example, one of the things that makes, and I talked about this in the stream earlier today, one of the things that makes the treatment of the book of Genesis as a kind of alternative science textbook for ancient Hebrews is that at the time that book was composed, there wasn't really a concept of scientific inquiry or of science or of any of the different things that would make that kind of that very type of literature even imaginable, much less its subject. So,
well, I mean, scientific concepts obviously have histories. Just like
exactly,
any of these.
I mean, I think could I make like a bit of a stronger claim though than that?
Sure,
and
yeah.
I wonder if we should be into the video more before I make this claim, but I think I'm going to use it as a framing claim. So there's two different ways of looking at social construction, I think. So one is that some phenomena X exists partially because social factors allowed it to exist as it does. It doesn't mean that it's arbitrary, that we could erase it from the face of the earth, that it's not a real thing, but that they're on a softer version of social construction, that there must have been reference to at least one social factor. So one of the beautiful examples that I just love is from Ian Hacking. And he talks about values in science. He's a philosopher of science, and he has a book called The Social Construction of What that Sunday and I have, been big fans of. I'm not sure if you also have dug too much into it, Shruggy, but that's one of the things that's kind of governing the conversation. And one of the discussions he has is, and I forget this in detail because it's been a while, but it's about the invention of penicillin. So the notion that, for instance, if we have a pathogen that we want to attack that's malignant, we would design something that would go after that particular type of pathogen. So in this case, bacteria, right? We went from a world in which we bound, infected bacteria-laden wounds with bandages, and they just festered, to a world in which we actually gave people antibiotics to treat the infection. And by treating the infection with antibiotics, you get what's called a looping effect. And so the bacterial infection then responds to the antibiotics and becomes more robust or changes form in order to deal with it's being approached as. Now, it is true that the bacteria responds to the antibiotics, but had we not singled out bacteria as a particular type of pathogen we were targeting because of its malignancy to us, it would not have responded in that cyclical way. So what we get from that is that there is a contingent truth associated with the existence of bacteria, whereby had we not socially selected for it, it would not independently of us start responding to that selection process. And so when we're dealing with that thicker, sort of like deeper idea of social construction, that's mainly what we're getting at. We're getting at some phenomena that is real and has truth conditionals associated with it. It can be the case, it cannot be the case that it responds, for instance, and it has a place in the world outside of us. But it didn't arise or come to be the way it is or continue to evolve without referencing the social factors that allowed for its existence. So that's where you get really deep into that stuff. And I think that's one of the best examples, because we don't need to even know about the existence of bacteria anymore, but it has mutated in accordance with our treatment of it, right?
Yeah, and I think just to add a little bit to that, so this is not just like a historical claim. You're also talking about an ongoing process.
Exactly, that's the important part of the loop.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, for example, somebody brought up gender roles. That's not just an historical fact. That's also something that's sort of maintained in real time.
Of course.
Specifically by social factors, exactly. So it's not just, you wouldn't say, for example, that science was a social construct, but now it is something that is no longer socially constructed. It is socially constructed constantly.
Well, and also that doesn't make it not real. Like, people have real, in some cases, very immutable gender identities and roles that are the basis of constant feedback and development over time until it solidifies into an identity. So these are real things. Like, these are not sort of arbitrary things that you could just cast aside. It would take a lot of looping again and reworking to manipulate them even remotely away from where they are now. These things have a real presence, right?
Yeah, so we should probably just get into the video at this point, let him speak for himself. We've given him 11 seconds so far, and all we see is a very surprised-looking Neil deGrasse Tyson, so... So please don't. Okay. Don't shoot. Okay.
Oh, God.
Okay, so you guys just tell me when you want me to stop, if you want to comment, and we'll just do it that way.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. 3, 2, 1, boom.
But before I can unveil the positive argument, which I have christened the Naturalist Nuke, I must first develop the philosophical groundwork that the argument rests upon. And that is the aim of this video, to assemble the core of the nuke. The motivation for this video series came from the political scientist, Christy Winters, who created 3 videos objecting to the content of Is Science a Social Construct? I have made an introductory video discussing the specific context of our dispute a few days prior to the release of this video. It is advised that the viewer watch that video before coming to this one.
Guys,
Well,
we need to stop and watch a 40-minute other video.
Nope. Continue.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
So who is this person?
What
What do they do?
What's wrong with you, Shruggy? It's King Crocoduck. Where have you been? He's the king. I'm the president.
Referring to Christy Winters as well. So just to kind of
Oh,
get some
okay, right.
context.
Sorry. So, this goes way back, actually. So King Crocoduck, of course, is sort of in the orbit of Sargon of Akkad, so you know all those people. Christy Winters is somebody who used to debate Sargon and I guess Crocoduck. I haven't been really aware of them for the last little while, but also the Distributist, curiously enough. So what did they have a debate on? There was a big one with Sargon a little while ago. But anyways, she runs a tiny, tiny little YouTube channel. She does little academic videos. She seems like a nice person overall. And for whatever reason, these people just like hate her like nothing else. It's so weird. But apparently she and King Crocoduck have been having a back and forth for quite a while now.
So what about this guy then?
King Crocoduck?
Yeah, like so they clearly have strong opinions about science and what it is and what it's not. Is this something they study in some capacity, or?
Well, King Crocoduck, I believe, is a physicist. He's a grad student specifically.
Okay.
I don't actually know what Christy Winters is. He says she's a political scientist. I'll take his word for it. Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't care about this guy enough to have like a full biography for him, unfortunately.
But in general, the flavor of people we're getting is somebody who's, deeply embedded in the hard sciences and the capacity as a physicist versus somebody who's going to be interested in value theory, probably feminist thought, and social sciences. So that's kind of the contrast between the two figures.
And as Seven Higgs just pointed out, he also comes from the sort of skeptosphere, so he's sort of that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
so
that tells me more than anything else. Okay.
Yes. Okay. All right, let's continue.
It is advised that the viewer watch that video before coming to this one. Before I begin developing my philosophy of science, I want to remind the audience that very few stances in philosophy can properly be regarded as unassailable. You can put 3 philosophers in the same room, and you won't even be able to get them to agree that there are 3 philosophers in the same room. That being said, philosophical projects aren't merely hopeless exercises in navel gazing.
Why are they
Or at
looking
least
at
they don't have to be. There can be immense benefit in clarifying how one organizes one's conception of a topic, even if no one else in the world can agree, either with this person or with each other, on every last detail. It doesn't really matter to me if you find my arguments unconvincing. If I've provoked you into thinking more seriously about these topics, then I've succeeded in my aims.
That's fair.
Unfortunately, for the purposes of this video, I cannot offer a comprehensive exposition of my philosophy of science. Time simply doesn't permit me to rigorously justify every last proposition that I make, which opens my perspective up to criticisms that might otherwise have been avoided had I offered a more complete picture of my opinions.
Okay, this is just a weird caveat to sort of guard himself with at the intro. He determines how long his video is, right? He has as much time as he wants.
We haven't gotten into the meat yet, so I would just kind of keep rolling until we do.
Yeah.
Yep.
There will be videos in which I do more than merely offer a sketch of what it is that I believe, and systematically develop the entirety of my thought on these matters, but this is not that video. I therefore implore the viewer to apply the principle of charity when evaluating what I have to say in the next few sections, and try to imagine how I might answer your objections before posting them in the comments. Given how long I've been grappling with these ideas, chances are that I've already considered the objections and that I do have answers to them, and you have my word that I will address them all in follow-up videos. With
So
that
he's
out of the
been
way,
doing this
let's
for a
start by
long time.
establishing my view of the relationship between science and philosophy.
Going on 7 years, I think.
Traditionally, philosophy has enjoyed the status of first knowledge, as an activity associated with the formulation of the grounds on which the understanding of reality, as well as the justification of knowledge claims, can be based. This status is one in which epistemology and ontology, which respectively concern themselves with the nature of knowledge and existence, are developed prior to the doing of any science, and this is the approach that Christy Winters endorses.
So the first question is what
whatever.
exists.
Okay.
And
I was just going to ask, is that true? But I guess we're going to find out.
Yeah, the diagram seems a bit.
Actually, this part's kind of important, so we should probably pay attention to this section in particular, because this is actually, Christy's going to be a little bit guilty here. This is going to be the source of some confusion early on, so let's just rewind a tiny bit.
Can be based. This status is one in which epistemology and ontology, which respectively concern themselves with the nature of knowledge and existence, are developed prior to the doing of any science, and this is the approach that Christy Winters endorses.
You know what's kind of interesting is
so the first
like
question
like Aristotle didn't work like that. Did Descartes work like that? I guess he started with epistemology and moved.
Yeah, so one thing I want to do is I want to kind of break this down into what's actually being referred to. So Sunday, this is really frustrating, but maybe we won't go back to it again. But it's like we start with questions about here's the problem. If you're looking, I know that later on he gets into pragmatism, so I kind of want to bookmark this a little bit. But if you're looking into what constitutes good inquiry, the whole point is you're not supposed to go in with a pre-existing idea of what we can know or what is. That's the thing you develop through the process of scientific inquiry, right? So this is lovely, but it's also asked backwards. Like just noting that, I'm going to bookmark it for that.
As we'll see, as if to emphasize that point, he's going to draw an arrow from ontology through to epistemology.
That's right.
Which Christy Winters furnishes him with, so it's not actually his fault.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I was noticing that even in her notes, and I was wondering what that was, because part of the problem with when we're engaging with philosophical concepts, we really have to bear down to what we're talking about. Like what concept of epistemology or knowledge or truth are we using? What are the methodologies that we're employing to get to that point? And as we'll find, empiricism is a legitimate philosophical methodology. So it's really important to get past the definitions of the terms into what they actually are referring to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going.
Christy Winters endorses.
So the first question is what exists? And science is out there to produce reliable knowledge about what exists. And what you think exists will determine what you investigate. And therefore, if you don't think that there is any social reality, well, this is going to influence your research agenda. But we'll get onto bias in a second. After you, well, not in conjunction with, knowing or thinking that you know or wanting to explore how things exist, what exists, the next step is how do we know about it? And this is where science comes in. And the fundamental problem that King Crocoduck makes in his video is that he skips epistemology and he goes right to methodology. And I'll explain methodology in a second. Epistemology is the process by which we can know about the thing we think exists. So your ontology, what you think exists, will influence the kind of questions you ask. What approach to epistemology you adopt in trying to answer those questions. And the
Can I just pause it for a second?
And how you...
Yep.
So I find this actually to be a little bit bad faith. Like I'm not a fan of this, just on the basis that this person is promoting a very specific form of philosophical understanding and acting as if that's sort of a universal statement about how we can arrive at philosophical knowledge. And so basically, when they say the person eschews epistemology and focuses on methodology, like I don't think she's acting in bad faith. I'm going to put it that way, but I think that there are elements of her argument that she's developing right now that are potentially misleading. Because when we say something like we're focusing on, justified true belief or inquiry or even fallibilist knowledge, like knowledge that can be reworked, but we think we know, but we don't really know. Any of that sort of process comes about because of various methodologies that we're employing. And so what she's suggesting is one methodology, and what he's suggesting is another methodology. It's not that he's replacing epistemology with methodology. It's that he's replacing one philosophical methodology with another, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
one sort of lesson I seem to be learning is that when it comes to philosophical methodology, it's really kind of a wild west. Like there aren't canons of philosophical methodology.
I mean, I disagree. What about empiricism, rationalism, and idealism, right?
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on the empiricist, depends on the rationalist to some degree. And I mean, if you look at the various works that people in these traditions write, they might proceed differently. They might do different things first. They might think that certain, they should describe their methodology and then they should proceed. Or they might think,
right.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just think we have maybe contending definitions of what is implicated by methodology. And so, yes, obviously what they do and how they approach various topics is going to differ person to person. But is the person coming into something as a realist or an anti-realist, believing in mind dependence, believing that the only true knowledge is based in this sort of, Gettier problem justified true belief thing, believing that inquiry starts with aesthetics. Like there's going to be different starting points and different commitments that shape the kinds of questions that are asked and the truths that come out of asking those questions. And you'll find that even King Crocoduck is coming up with a kind of weird version of pragmatism in this, which makes certain assumptions that are common to the kinds of assumptions that I make. And I have a completely different methodology than him. So yes, but also, depending on which of these starting points we're using, like ontology or an ontological analysis, rationalist analysis, process of inquiry, whatever, we're going to be engaging in different types of philosophy. That's kind of what I'm referring to, right?
Yeah, those categories are fine. I guess my only point is that you can kind of pick which one you want, and you can kind of do something new if you're creative enough. Even if you're doing something new, it's probably going to fall into one of those frameworks, like roughly speaking, in terms of types of questions you're asking, what you think about the status of truth, what you think about the status of knowledge, what you think the role of empirical information is in developing a position, and on, right? Yeah, that's true. You probably will fall into. I mean, there are ways of categorizing, any possible thing you could do. I don't think we're making. I think we're making independent points here.
Well, I think you're both right. I think the point that Jalma is trying to emphasize is that there is some level of stability to the different kinds of methodological, I guess, bubbles you can find yourself in. It's not like I think what he was objecting to is the Wild West comment, not necessarily what you were actually trying to imply. So I think we're all more or less in agreement here. I don't think any of us are saying there's only one particular way to do this or that there's none.
So in fact, we're using methodology in two different ways, right? So
Well, I guess just real practically, if you're writing a PhD in philosophy, if you're writing a dissertation, and you're asked to say what your methodology is, you can kind of pick one thing or a different thing. Really, you just have to be able to justify your approach. You have to show that there's some thoughtfulness that's being put into it. But you can kind of do what you want. But sorry, go ahead.
All I'm saying is that's fully true, but then you could also organize those approaches into things like empiricist approaches, rationalist approaches, idealist approaches, pragmatic approaches. So there's different I think the word I'm trying to get at is there's different traditions that you can be operating within. And those traditions have different senses of like what the truth is, where the process of inquiry about some topic ought to start, what the role of epistemology is, and on and on and on. And so what you and I are both getting at is that basically when Christy Winters is making the point about we should start with epistemology, not methodology, it's like, actually starting with epistemology is a methodology. And then we're kind of debating over how we can organize methodologies in philosophy more broadly into these categories or not, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Thank you, Christy, for derailing this right at the gate.
We're derailing ourselves. But
exactly.
Yes, continue.
Interpret your results. All science is a process of knowledge production. That's what science is. It is a method for producing knowledge. And if you look at it within that system or within that definition, it automatically becomes a social construct.
From these clips, it's evident that Christie takes science, which she correctly characterizes in methodological terms, to be dependent upon a prior set of epistemological commitments, in which it has decided how the objects of scientific investigation can be known. This in turn depends on a prior set of ontological commitments, in which it has decided what sorts of things can be said to exist, and therefore be proper objects of scientific investigation. And crucially, since it is human beings who agree, via authoritative consensus, what sorts of things exist and how they can be understood, then the methodological practices which constitute science are, fundamentally, a product of agreements between humans. Science emerges from a philosophical foundation, and the philosophical foundation is socially constructed. Therefore, science is socially constructed.
That doesn't make sense.
No, he's doing a little. He's being clever, right? Like he's using a little bit of deductive reasoning right there. But we'll continue.
I don't think. I think he. I haven't watched all of Christy Winter's videos on this, but I think that's actually a fair representation of what her argument is.
Sure.
Like, here's the thing. Like, I was a little bit suspicious when I went through the one that he cites directly here because he cuts it, right? But when I actually look through what he cuts, there's literally nothing there. Like her entire part where she was talking about epistemology, she just skips. It's really bizarre. So and she does just go right into saying, therefore, when you look at it this way, it's a social construct. So he's actually supplying like some semblance of a process here where there really was just a statement. So I don't think this is actually his fault.
Sure, fair enough.
Yeah.
Small thing.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody tells you this is how you need to do philosophy, I mean, if you're not convinced that they've demonstrated to you why this is how you should do philosophy, you should ask why. But anyway.
I mean, my immediate issue here is that this is sort of assumed that because science is sort of emergent from ontology and epistemology, that therefore science itself is socially constructed. And I don't know if that makes sense to me. I mean,
well, what he's going to do is he's going to highlight how potentially this is a cause constitution error, right? That's so it potentially doesn't make sense because it may well be a cause constitution error. Anyway,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's keep going.
My fundamental error, according to Christie, is that I went straight to methodology without first talking about epistemology and ontology. This, in her view, betrays my ignorance of the philosophy of science, an ignorance which she takes to be common among natural scientists. Had I understood that scientific methodology lies upon a philosophical foundation, I surely would never have tried to argue that science isn't a social construct. If only I weren't ignorant about the fact that philosophy was invented thousands of years before science. Indeed, that philosophers practically invented science.
This is all irrelevant.
Silly me. So how am I to respond to this? Well, first, I'm going to start by rejecting philosophy as a foundation for scientific practice.
Small note.
This is not a
I don't think that it's true that philosophy predates science. I think.
Yeah, I know. I agree with you. I think that's an absolutely spurious claim.
Yeah, I agree with that too, weirdly. And this seems to like go against the idea of science being a social construct, just sort of in the way he's framing it, but it's also kind of not. You just have to kind of like be paying attention to, I don't know. It depends on how you define science, first of all. If you're talking about science as defined in modernity, then I guess it sort of works. But if you're talking about science as in
I don't
sort
think
of
it does, historically.
Okay, but like maybe you're talking about sort of science in kind of an inclusive Hegelian sense in which you can incorporate into your definition of science the fact that it's constantly changing as its view of the world evolves over time.
Okay, if you read like Aristotle's Physics or
that's what I was going to say.
Generation of Animals or like any of his, actually he has quite a few biological works. A lot of it's empirical. A lot of he's like describing the anatomy of a snail. Like it's
now here's my contention though. I think that's also philosophical. So that's just like a definitional.
Well, hang on, wait a second.
The thing that's new is the distinction between the two. But sorry, continue.
Between the two being
science and philosophy.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So science is distinct from philosophy, not just as an activity that we eventually distinguish from philosophy.
The distinction between the two is a relatively new distinction. I mean, the people who
I agree with that.
The people doing science.
What I would argue though is that in Aristotelian terms, scientific or sort of empiricist practices are themselves a type of philosophical practice, and we see that through the pragmatists and other people in terms of how they carry forward through Aristotle in very unique and interesting ways. But anyway, that's just
that being said, I do think we're missing the point a little bit here, because I think the argument or the argument he's referring to isn't that the distinction of science from philosophy is new. I think the point is that there's a sense in which there's a way in which a lot of people characterize what we would sort of retroactively call science as philosophy. So
to be clear, this was a tangent, and I apologize.
No, it's fine. It's just that I don't think.
So basically, so can I just summarize what I think just happened here?
Go for it.
So basically, there is a thing that is scientific practice that is separate from the thing that is philosophizing in the public imagination, and both are as ancient as Aristotle potentially, and separate, and involve different types of methodologies. My contention is that scientific and empiricist methodologies are actually also kind of philosophical because they can be developed into systems like pragmatism and on Peirce's construction, like scholastic realist construction.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what was going on there.
Yeah, and what I'm sort of indicating is that I would even go like pre-philosophy in the sense that Plato characterized it, and I would characterize like a lot of what was done previously as philosophy, like by people like Pythagoras, for example, as being also science. I would characterize that. I think that it's appropriate to regard a lot of what they were doing as science.
Yeah, just like it's appropriate to regard a lot of post-positivist thought as also scientific. And anyway, yeah.
It's also relevant in terms of whether or not either is a social construct, and in fact, philosophy itself is as well. But we can continue.
What we're getting is an image where philosophy and science as concepts are both incredibly complex and ancient and have a very intricate relationship with each other that is not obviously the one that's being presented in this video. Yeah.
That's fair.
Well said. Let's go.
Rejection of philosophy per se, just a rejection of the role that Christie and others like her assign to it. As a naturalist, I do not accept philosophy's claim to the special status traditionally allocated to it. I do not recognize the legitimacy of the epistemologists, the ontologists, or the metaphysicians who presume it to be their job to set the agenda for scientific practice prior to any input by the scientists themselves. This is not to say that epistemology, ontology, and metaphysics have no role in science. On the contrary, I think they're essential. But rather that the relationship between the philosopher and the scientist is not, as Christie suggests, unidirectional, with a decidedly philosophical foundation.
Often it's identity.
Sorry, do you want to say that again?
Well, often the philosophers and the scientists are the same people. That's actually a trend in a lot of subdisciplines, like philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of biology. You kind of have to do both to, contribute anything to those debates in like the 21st century. Maybe not in the past. Anyway, continue.
Christie suggests unidirectional, with a decidedly philosophical foundation. I think that the relationship between science and philosophy, at least when these activities are done well, is mutually interactive. In other words, I think that metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology should fundamentally be informed by the contents of our best empirical theories, which result from the application of scientific methodology, and that the role of these philosophical modes of thought, when applied fruitfully, is to help facilitate scientific practice via the clarification and reorganization of concepts relevant to those theories. The result is a positive feedback loop, in which scientific methodology tests models, philosophy helps to refine the models by clarifying and reorganizing their attendant concepts, scientific methodology then tests those revised models, and philosophy responds by revising its epistemic, ontological, and metaphysical concepts in light of the revised model's results. And, for reasons that I'll be developing in the next video, I think that methodology is what kicks off this entire process. We don't begin with premises about what exists and what can be known, and from them deduce a scientific program, but rather begin with methodological modes of thought, from which we organize our philosophical programs. In expressing the relationship between science and philosophy in this manner, I have essentially stated that there is nothing special about ontology and epistemology in relation to scientific methodology. These philosophical...
Are we pausing?
Just do you want to keep going, or do you want to?
No, I do want to keep going. I'm waiting until he gets to Peirce.
Oh, of course you are. Of course you are. Why wouldn't you be? All right.
Yeah, because he's making a mistake. But in general, I think this is a really good section.
No, this is actually good.
You guys like this?
So let's keep going, if you're okay.
Yeah, Shruggy, what did you say?
I said, really? You guys like this?
I'm finding it relatively inoffensive. I have some issues, but they'll come up later.
Let me put the pragmatist claim out there first, and then you can fight me. How about that?
Go for it.
Well, I mean, once we get to that section, then Shruggy can fight me.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
thought,
okay, continue.
On this developing in the next video, I think that methodology is what kicks
There we go. Sorry about that.
off this entire process. We don't begin with premises about what exists and what can be known, and from them deduce a scientific program, but rather begin with methodological modes of thought, from which we organize our philosophical programs. In expressing the relationship between science and philosophy in this manner, I have essentially stated that there is nothing special about ontology and epistemology in relation to scientific methodology. These philosophical modes of thought don't come prior to science, but in fact respond to it. Even if it were true that philosophy has historically preceded science, which, as we'll see in the next video, I don't believe to actually be the case, this would not prohibit the relationship between them from being organized in the manner that I've just described. The basic idea that the duties of the philosopher are carried out in tandem with, as opposed to prior to, the duties of the scientist has been a staple of naturalistic approaches to the philosophy of science for decades. Indeed, the most celebrated expositor of naturalized epistemology, Willard Quine, introduced the first major iteration of that program over 50 years ago, when he cast epistemology in psychological terms, thus placing this formerly philosophical enterprise under the umbrella of scientific thought.
Sorry, what's that?
And of course, he's a philosopher, so keep going.
Yeah. This has also been an extremely challenged thesis.
Oh, absolutely, because of the naturalistic fallacy, which we can get into a little bit later. But here we go. It's my man.
It's your paramour.
Exactly.
Pragmatist modes of philosophical thought, which similarly reject the kind of a priori theorizing that I'm railing.
I'm going to redo this section quickly because we were kind of interjected. I want to make sure that we actually understand what he said.
Absolutely.
Indeed, the most celebrated expositor of naturalized epistemology, Willard Quine, introduced the first major iteration of that program over 50 years ago, when he cast epistemology in psychological terms, thus placing this formerly philosophical enterprise under the umbrella of scientific thought. Pragmatist modes of philosophical thought, which similarly reject the kind of a priori theorizing that I'm railing against, originated 100 years prior with the works of Charles Sanders Peirce. The point being, I'm not making this stuff up. It's been part of the philosophical landscape for the past 150 years. Christy Winters...
So, it's like I'm almost like overwrought trying to interact with this. Now, there's, again, how do I put it? The spirit behind what he is discussing seems to be on point. However, the terminology that he's using is potentially misleading. And so when we go all the way back to that kind of like weird looping effect between the development of, theories of knowledge or truth and scientific inquiry and practice, he starts it out by saying that basically there are, quotes, methodological modes of inquiry that precede the development of any kind of epistemological position. So going all the way back to Peirce's early work, what Peirce is interested primarily in is what he calls the degrees or grades of inquiry. And so Peirce is, first of all, a fallibilist. He doesn't believe that we can ever kind of, deduce or infer the nature of the universe in a way that's final, although he holds out hope that there's some, abstract, vague future in which the end of inquiry could occur, even if it's beyond our human imagination or conception. But in addition to that, he also has a sense that we use three different types of inquiry in pretty much our everyday processes. And so the first grade or degree of inquiry is what we would call common sense. And so that's what we get as a kind of logica utens, or kind of like practical logic. And so the notion of, don't go outside without an umbrella. If it's raining, you'll get soaked. Like that's a kind of commonsensical idea about the way the world works. And this benefits us tremendously. And in fact, he believes that we're way less rational in kind of deductive, mathematical or even empiricist terms than we think we are. And we rely on common sense actually quite frequently. And so we have to kind of come to terms in some psychologistic sense with our own irrationality. That's the first degree of inquiry. The second degree has to do with, people like Russell and famous mathematicians and a lot of the analytic philosophers and post-positivist philosophers who believe that, the most profound and enduring truths are derived deductively and mathematically. And so we can basically engage in syllogistic reasoning and develop truths that are kind of binding or hold us to the world, or that we can use as the foundation for our beliefs. The difficulty that he has with this is that people are more likely than not simply to memorize deductive forms of reasoning without actually critically considering what started the inquiry to begin with, or what started the process of using these forms of reasoning to begin with. And so from there, we reach the third grade of inquiry, which is an abductive process. And what that means is that we have a doubt about something that we need to erase and move from doubt to belief. And that doubt is a non-arbitrary doubt usually. Usually that doubt has to do with something we think is bad, something we notice in the world that we don't like or we have a problem with, or it could just be something about our knowledge base that seems to be off. So for instance, I have a doubt, for instance, that all apples are red. I haven't seen enough apples. We have the black swan thing going on here. I don't have a sense that like it is maybe constitutionally like a necessary property of apples that they be red. And in order to erase my doubt about the redness of apples, I want to try and find as many, not just individual apples, but as much relevant data and information about apples as I can get until such a point as I feel satiated. So what's happening here is that although the methodology that I'm employing isn't one that's based in the nature of what apples are or some justified true belief I have about what I can know about the apple's redness, it is nonetheless based in more than mere methodology. What it's based in instead is this genuine doubt I have that this is a true or good or meaningful belief about X, and I need to erase that doubt. And so the thing I liked about that looping process is it kind of shows how knowledge is developed and reified over time via the process of the erasure of doubt using that third grade of inquiry. And so that's really what Peirce is doing. And I think it's important to clear that up because it also shows really in a really lovely and interesting way how, of course, the scientific process is value-laden and is necessarily a social construct. So that's what I'm going to say about that.
And Shruggy, you didn't like that.
Shruggy?
You're muted.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, there are a few things I could say about it. So, I mean, okay, I'll start with the least interesting.
Do you want me to bring the diagram back up?
Yeah. Why don't you do that?
Let me try and find it without skipping past the entire video again. This
so
one?
there are two reasons why this is descriptively inadequate to like how science actually works. First of all, it's stepwise, right? You do the first thing, and then you do the second thing, and then you do the third thing. The second of all, it's compartmentalized, right? So you refine the methodology, and then you update your ontology and your epistemology, and then you refine your methodology, and then you know, like as if these are going on, you know, distinctly in different camps or by different people. Or
they
something.
don't have to be. They can happen simultaneously. But anyway.
Well, it's a giant community of people doing stuff all at the same time and like all kind of interacting with some of each other.
Yeah, and that's already adapting Peirce, right? Like, so that doesn't, I'm just saying that, like, note that there's, you know, repartees, those two things, that's all.
But there's an even bigger descriptive inadequacy of this, and that's that, like, episodes of really interesting, really exciting scientific discovery, they're kind of just stumbled upon a lot of the times. Like, people just have flashes of insight, or they just put two things that were sitting around together and, oh, it's the solution. Like, or, you know,
yeah,
you have like
except
a
there
weird
doesn't
dream of a snake.
No, hang on, let Freddie finish. I actually have, I'm probably preempting the same point that you're making, but I actually want to like hear him finish this off.
Of course, sorry.
Well, I mean, the basic point is that a lot of great scientific discoveries are not things that proceed via these principled, you know, pre-established methodologies, or are, you know, a lot of the times they kind of just are stumbled upon. In fact, if you look at there's a literature on scientific discovery, and one of the issues for that literature is that people are kind of scratching their heads because so many great instances of scientific discovery, scientific breakthroughs, it's almost like the more like incredible they were, the less principled they were, it seems sometimes. Like, how do you explain this? It's so unprincipled. But I mean, if we care about how, you know, great scientific discoveries are made, a diagram like this is not going to be, if we're trying to describe the process, how it actually works, something like this is just not going to match the world. But anyway.
Well, yeah. So I'm just going to jump in quickly because I haven't.
Okay.
I just want to see if I can get validated because I'm the one non-philosopher here. But one thing that hacking suggests that I find kind of interesting is that, well, one could argue that, with respect to this literature, I presume you're referring to people like Thomas Kuhn, where it seems to be rather bizarre. These paradigms seem to impose themselves with a force all their own that doesn't actually lead from the logic of scientific inquiry that pre-exists it. It's just a sudden gestalt shift that has no precipitation in current science or in normal science in between revolutions, as Thomas Kuhn characterizes it. What Hacking suggests, which is really interesting, is that, well, that may be true as a tendency in our recent history, but there is no guarantee that that will be the case in the future. That may have been like a weird phase that will then be followed by no major paradigm shifts for a very long time, if at all.
Well,
yeah,
I mean, maybe, but
and I think that's true, and I think that's a really sort of nice way of characterizing the way that inquiry tends to occur in fits and starts. And so, again, so absolutely, and I fully agree with that. So again, though, Shruggy, I think we might actually be agreeing more than we think we're agreeing, because I think what I would say is, well, then absolutely, this chart presented in front of me does not adequately encapsulate pragmatist methodology, which via that kind of erasure of doubt and the formation of belief attempts to preserve against these very formulaic principled sort of didactic systems the organicness of scientific thought and discovery and the kind of instantaneousness and the non-inevitability of it, given those systems. That's a really important part of Peirce's phenomenology and a lot of what he's working on. And yet so he's a phenomenologist on the one hand, and that's the whole purpose of having like a belief that arrives sort of organically. Like that's exactly the process that's being described. And so I think what you and I are both noting is that this chart is inadequate for both describing pragmatist traditions and other traditions. So I think that we're kind of in agreement.
Crucially as well. Sorry, go on, Charlie.
Well, lest I oversold my point about this sort of apparent lack of a logic of discovery, there are far fewer of those dramatic episodes than there are, subsequent scientific achievements. There is a sort of plodding, follow the methodology, apply the thing that you've applied a million times to this new, or to like some small subpopulation that you haven't yet or something. That happens too. There is this sort of piecemeal normal science, as you put it, and as Kuhn put it. So that accounts for the bulk of, what's a gender neutral term for manpower? Person power. That accounts for more logged hours.
From on Zizek's view, it'd be less insulting to use the word manpower, but anyway.
I don't know. But yeah, so I hope I didn't oversell that. But both of those things are phases of scientific activity, and they're very different looking. Yeah. But
of course, so I think all I'm saying is that if you were to take this and translate it out into my lens, I'm not in any way trying to attempt to sell you on, Peirce's pragmatism or anything. And he calls it pragmatism instead of pragmatism per William James, those people. But basically, I'm not trying to sell you on it. What I'm saying is that, yes, so what you're describing there then is the actual process of inquiry by which we erase doubt. And there's a bunch of like extreme detail and complexity that goes into how we adjudicate empirical evidence and what metaphysical categories may arise from that, and on. But that impulse, that spark, that doubt we have, the normative judgments we're making about the world, maybe even that lead to that initializing that process, is in keeping with that kind of energetic Kuhnian research paradigm sort of statement that may occasionally lead to these like spontaneous insights. And so I think both are accounted for both through what initiates the process and through the methodology that's engaged in during the process, right?
Okay, now to bring us back to King Crocoduck quickly, I think it's important to remember that while we can find a way to make this sort of amenable minimally to how we think science actually works, he's doing something very specific here that actually has very little to do with that, in fact. What he's actually trying to do is to assert the epistemic equality of the hard sciences with philosophy in its generality with respect to specific questions, in particular, whether or not social factors play into our understanding of science or the objects of science. So...
Can I just add one final note on this whole thing before we move past the Peirce point? So Peirce is a scholastic realist. He's not a nominalist. So somebody said he was a nominalist in the comments, and I just saw that. That's not true. Anyway.
Let's defend the honor of Peirce at all costs.
Not really, but, in this case.
All right, let's find out where we were. I should write down the times when I skip like this. This is kind of dumb. All right. I think we're about... Good God. Is that Christy Winters? Okay, here we go. I think we're getting close. We're getting close. Come on.
What's happening?
Actually, I'm
I'm
just
just trying to find out where we were before we...
I'm going to go to the washroom really quickly right now while you do this, okay?
Okay, sure. Sounds good.
In 50 years. Christy Winters is not a naturalist.
Good. Okay, so we're there. All right. So, while Jalma is gone...
Well, I guess I had a follow-up point.
Please.
I do like how Peirce talks about the role that doubt plays. So, like, you know, we only investigate questions that, like, concern us or that bother us or that we're interested in for some reason. So I do like that it's introducing that aspect of the picture. But anyway.
Yeah, I think the principal issue here is that he's not actually invoking Peirce, he's just invoking his face. He actually hasn't really given a substantive explanation of what's actually informing his position. Or, I mean, he's trying to say that it's a mainstream position, so he's not making it up, which I guess is sort of fine, but he's picking highly contentious and sometimes very obscure, relatively obscure, I should say, figures, and then representing those as if that's sort of the unproblematic face of current philosophy. Or unproblematic face of current philosophy, yeah.
I guess I kind of, my spidey sense, no, I don't have an idiom, but I felt weird when he said, so this is stuff that's been in the philosophical tradition for a long time, presumably applying to the way that he's construing this.
I think he meant like for the past like roughly just under 100 years, which I guess is kind of fair.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of just saying, you know, all of the academic philosophers, they are saying what I am saying. What I am saying is in the literature. I don't know. It's kind of just...
Yeah, which again,
but
they're not.
Analytics for the most part. And that's so what he might be saying is a lot of the analytic philosophers might be somewhat in line with what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, which
is really not many of them at all. Again, like that book, Naturalizing Epistemology, is extremely criticized. I think there's even a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on it. You can just see like how many major philosophers disagree with it and have written extensively on what's wrong with it. But we don't really need to focus too hard on that because he doesn't go into it here. So we can just continue. Ready to go?
Yep.
In 50 years. Christy Winters is not a naturalist. Her understanding of the philosophy of science is very clearly predicated, almost exclusively, on this book by Jonathan Griggs, which explicitly advocates an anti-naturalist approach. Her slides pertaining to the philosophy of science, which she used in order to develop the basis for her critique of my philosophy, are practically copy and pasted from Chapter 4 of his book. This is an unusual decision because Griggs is a scholar of sports studies. He's a researcher of sports. That doesn't make him an illegitimate source for a person's understanding of the philosophy of science, but he certainly is an unusual one. Ordinarily, if one wishes to understand
he's not a philosopher of science. So, like, what's he doing bashing this guy for being a sports scientist? Whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, it's like
because sports studies is lame. It's like feminist basket weaving. Come on, Shruggy.
Okay, but if you're a physicist, you're not thereby a good philosopher of science. But he's not a physicist. He's a physics graduate.
He is a physicist.
Damn straight.
Okay, let's say he's a physicist.
Let's say. Okay, keep going. Yeah. Okay. Anyways.
Philosophy of science, it's helpful to consult with the works of, well, philosophers. For my own part, I've been highly influenced by people like Willard Quine, Charles Sanders Peirce, Susan Hack, Daniel Dennett, David Hume, Alexander Rosenberg, Karl Popper, Patricia Churchland, and John Bickel. I'm not saying that a person's philosophy of science necessarily
That's kinda
has
helpful.
to be influenced by philosophers.
This image,
I mean,
though,
it would be if he invoked any of their arguments so far. Maybe he will later on, but
I see the general trend. They're
you?
yeah, kind of reductionist,
kind of naturalist,
empiricist.
pragmatist philosophers who are reductivists about truth, and yeah.
I mean, I guess, but I sincerely, like, with the exception of Dennett, I don't think for a second that he's read Peirce. I think he's probably gone through a Wikipedia article on Wikipedia articles under the positions that he's taken because they seem kosher in skeptosphere lingo, and he's just picked notable philosophers from there. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not seeing like a derivation from these actual philosophers here. That's like again, like, he can't quote a single person.
We just need to move on to get past this image that's just really frustrating me.
I mean, this is like his major influence, so we need to like.
Alone. There have been important figures, like Thomas Kuhn and Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who have been major influences on my own philosophy of science, despite the fact that they themselves never received degrees in philosophy. I'm just saying that it's unusual to lean so heavily on the work of a sports studies scholar in forming your own understanding of the philosophy of science, and it helps to explain it.
Does this guy have a degree in philosophy?
Yeah, and also keep in mind that some of the best philosophers were largely considered like potentially scientists or operating in completely different spheres. There's one point about Hume versus Popper and pragmatists and all those other people too. Like, these are not all the same type of philosopher, put it that way as well. Like, they have radically different claims about the nature of reality and the structure of inquiry and the rest of it. So, yeah.
I think, again, like, with respect to does he have a degree in philosophy thing, of course not. But again, like, you have to go back to that, like, that scheme he had for the relationship between science and philosophy. And I'm not arguing at all that scientists are in any way subordinate to philosophers, but he's trying specifically to say that scientists and philosophers are on an equal footing with respect to more or less the same kind of epistemological problems, or the same kind of philosophical problems, I should say. So it doesn't actually matter that he's not trained as a philosopher because he's trained as a scientist. And what he's trying to argue here is that these are more or less equivalent. This is why it's important that science isn't a social construct, and why he bothers to mention that there's this sort of ridiculous notion that philosophy predates science, therefore science is in some way subordinate to it. So this is like representing a deep-seated sort of departmental insecurity.
Yep. But also, naturalism is a legitimate philosophical doctrine, and there's a lot of stuff about the naturalistic fallacy. But that being said, like, empiricist naturalism, starting with Hume and going from there, is a legitimate, trend in philosophical thought. It's just that the difficulty is that is not summative of the claims of people from Hume and onwards have made, right? And so they've been everything from nominalists to hard realists. They made a variety of different claims about whether or not, phenomena themselves constitute a legitimate means of developing inquiry, what the role of empiricism is, all kinds of things like that. So he's in a kind of a broad tradition, and the naturalistic tradition that influences his discipline is a legitimate one. He's just not necessarily looking at the contours of that, because these are all still philosophers of science, right? Yeah,
and I guess, like, my only issue with this is that he's only using the faces of these philosophers, and he's not actually saying how their approach informs. He's just simply saying that it does, therefore my approach is in some sense more valid than if I hadn't said that.
Precisely. So here's one difference that might show you just how different they are. Like, Hume, for instance, is a nominalist in the sense that he believes in mind dependence, even if he's even if he's also a determinist. And so we can observe through the mind the causal effect of phenomena in the world, and we're able to actually sort of objectively pin something on that and note that it is real, but only because we're able to consistently observe it in that form of cause effect that allows him to be a determinist. And so you wouldn't necessarily expect that. You wouldn't necessarily expect that Kuhnian paradigms are so amenable to social constructionist claims. You wouldn't necessarily expect that, Hegelian idealism might find its way into the way that we discuss what kinds of philosophical ideas we want to pursue empirically. You wouldn't necessarily expect that Peirce would be a realist. Like, there's many things that you wouldn't expect that come out of this as well, right? So there's subtlety and complexity here.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
Why Christie was so bewildered by some of the decisions that I made in the video that she is criticizing. She seems oblivious to naturalistic accounts of science, which is embarrassing given her repeated accusation that I'm the one who's ignorant of the philosophy of science. It's like she isn't aware that naturalism, for at least the past 50 years, has been predicated upon the rejection of the statuses of ontology and epistemology as
Can I
first knowledge.
just pause something quickly?
Yeah.
There's just one thing I want to say that's kind of a meta point about the nature of a lot of YouTube discourse. I think that King Crocoduck's been pretty fair-minded and reasonable and decent about how he's approached things. But one thing that really annoys me about how people argue for things on the internet, and hopefully we haven't done this too much ourselves, is the kind of the ad hominem denigrating or attacking of the person rather than the ideas. Like putting her in like making her look clownish, or like, influencing people towards liking his opinions or views on kind of non-argumentative but rather ideological grounds. I just hate when people do that, because I think that, epistemic humility, or humility of what we can know, and generosity are important. And so hopefully we've corrected ourselves enough to acknowledge that, yes, there's some instances in which Christy herself makes mistakes that he then picks up on. And there's other instances in which he himself is dead right about, what naturalism does and is useful for and that kind of thing. So when people start to frame each other as clownish, or they just sort of dismiss them on each other on the face of it, I think that leads to poor quality discussion. And I think it's an unfortunate tendency. It's how these things go. So
I agree. And to be fair, like, Christie's not entirely innocent of this either. I don't think she engages in quite the same thing.
I don't think she is. I'm just noting in general, it's a problem.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, to his credit, he's not very good at it. So.
Yeah, exactly. That is to his credit.
Something prior to the scientific activity. What I did, in going straight to methodology, without first sitting in an armchair and speculating about what exists and what can be known about it, has been standard practice among naturalists for half a century now, and Christie might have known that, and recognized its application in my video, had she read more widely than just those texts, which confirm the position that she's already habituated towards. All I'm saying is, it's not a good look when your understanding of the philosophy of science is limited to the contents of an obscure work by some sports studies scholar, and then when confronted with material issuing from literature outside of the very narrow domain that you've been reading in, you mistake it for ignorance. I know that standing up on that hill
I like that.
Which meme?
There was an attempt. I've used that many times.
There was. I feel like that, at the risk of contradicting what I've just said in the lecture I just gave, who knows who that actually refers to, but anyway.
You mistake it for ignorance. I know that standing up on that hill gives you the impression that you can see farther than I can, Christie, but that's only because you're unfamiliar with the terrain.
Yeah, so again, like, so much of this is just built on departmental insecurity about him not being able to comment upon philosophical questions because frankly, like, he can, but it's not a departmental distinction that King Crocoduck himself seems to be incapable of doing so.
No, here's the worst part of this, though. Like, I'm actually going to defend him for a second.
Sure.
Because it's actually unlikely that she's delved as deeply into the actual empirical methodologies and frames that allow a physicist to operate in a naturalist mode as he has. Like, she hasn't physically done
I'd agree. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, absolutely.
He actually does have a well-held set of reasons for pursuing a naturalist frame, and people can be very sneering and dismissive about that for people working in the sciences, and it frustrates them.
And to be clear, lest anyone be fooled that because we're also criticizing King Crocoduck that any of us are sympathetic to Christie Winters, his conception of the relationship between science and philosophy and all the problems that come with it are entirely predicated on a model that she gave.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In any event, the manner in which I conceptualize the relationship between science and philosophy defeats this particular charge of social constructionism. According to Christie, accounts of what exists and what criteria are associated with the acquisition of knowledge, the objects of ontology and epistemology, are fundamentally a product of authoritative consensus. I, on the other hand, take these to actually be the result of the application of scientific methodology, at least when they're done well.
It's expanding someone.
Moreover,
what's that?
It's expanding someone help us.
Since I take the natural methodology that we typically associate with scientific practice to be the activity that kicks things off in this relationship, the entirety of my philosophical program becomes naturalized. I submit to you that the only things that we have any right to say exist are those things which are posited by the contents of our best empirical theories, and that the only things that we get to call knowledge are those things which at some point see application in those theories.
But does he know this?
Ooh, okay, but here's the other thing too: is he's going on and on about how he's a naturalist, and I'm sure he is one. But we know the definition of naturalism is that, an idea is. Oh God, okay, hang on a second. I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm getting tired now. Basically, that things are properly reducible to a method of scientific inquiry on the basis of science. This is very, very surface level and shoddy, so just take this with a grain of salt. On the basis of science tracks the contents of the natural world, and everything is natural. So the naturalistic fallacy is that, well, then if scientific practice tracks the contents of the natural world and everything can be really encompassed in the natural world, then the natural world is good and scientific practice is the best practice we can apply to it. And so there's a whole sort of set of assumptions about nature and the goodness of nature and how nature totalizes the terrain of what we can explore using this type of inquiry, blah, blah. So he's kind of letting the ball drop on the naturalism point right now, which I'm a little bit frustrated by. But anyway.
Yeah, Shruggy, did you want to comment on that at all, or?
Well, I think there are a lot of different conceptions of naturalism. I mean, I think under some description, I'd probably characterize myself as being naturalistically inclined, but I don't recognize any of the stuff he's talking about.
What immediately makes me not really suspicious, but what looks strange to me is he thinks methodology kicks things off, right? And if you think of methodology in terms of just like a thing someone does or tries, then I guess in a sense maybe. But when we think of methodology, we tend to think of something that's standardized, and that's going to be standardized within a social context, right? So I'm not entirely clear how this helps him escape from, again, like the conception of science as involving a methodology, the conception of a methodology as being adequate, the conception of the object that the methodology is being applied to is something discrete. These are all going to be things that are going to be agreed upon within a social context. So whether or not like this is an accurate representation of every naturalistic point or of the best naturalistic point or whatever you want, his goal here is to establish that science is not a social construct, and this doesn't seem to get him anywhere towards that end.
It doesn't, because it talks about what happens. Like, so what you're saying, a methodology is employed. Okay, that's sort of like saying mistakes are made. And so what are you actually like obliquely leaving out or implicitly referencing, right? So whether or not that thing occurs in the natural world is almost kind of beside the point, whatever definition of naturalism we want to employ. I would argue in some ways I'm not really a naturalist, but tending towards that as well. So we're looking at this sort of claim about methodology. And what are we pursuing? Because we know that we can't pursue something in ideal terms. And we know that when we pursue some line of inquiry, we're doing it to answer a question. We're doing it to figure out something that is relevant to us in some significant sense, even if the point is that it exceeds us or it has nothing to do with us. We are selecting, not arbitrarily necessarily, but maybe in terms of what we value as good, from reality, from what exists out there, from what exists in the natural world, from what God has given us, whatever conception you want to employ, in order to determine on the answer to some question. So he's skipping that whole process. And the whole point of a looping effect, which I think he's sufficiently encompassing here, is that it loops, right? We don't have an actual starting point. And so he's
well, this isn't a loop. This is a spiral. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a Fibonacci sequence. No, I'm joking. That's just, yeah.
Ugh. All right. Enough of that.
Program becomes naturalized. Are those things which at some point see application in those theories.
Oh, okay. We skipped ahead a bit.
The only things that we get to call knowledge are those things which at some point see application in those theories. What I've just said will require some justification, since there will inevitably be those who don't want to organize knowledge in this fashion, opting instead to abstract from some set of a priori premises pertaining either to what exists or to what can be known.
Literally,
and
that
so
was
it will
just
pay
an
to
a
take a
priori
moment
premise.
to
Okay. What he just said was that was an a priori premise.
I was going to say the same thing.
It is like look at that diagram. Like he's kind of just delivering that,
Yeah, exactly.
He's kind of just thinking about it, and then he wrote a little diagram that represents it and giving us that. And that's where that's coming from. It's
a priori doesn't
a priori.
mean, yeah, exactly. A priori doesn't mean you didn't think about it to get it. It means it was you acquired it through thought before applying it to anything in the world or applying it to.
Yeah, or rather, it didn't derive from the a posteriori realm. Like you can't derive it from any aspect of your actual existence, basically, right?
Yeah, if you just start with a handful of categories and then proceed from there, those are a priori.
Yeah, it doesn't actually matter how you get those categories.
Exactly.
It has to do with its relation to, I don't know what you want to call it, but like its place in a reasoning process is before.
Somebody's been reading Kant, anyway.
Distinguish my pragmatist perspective from the a priori approach endorsed by people like Jonathan Grix and Christy Winters.
Who's a sports therapist? Sorry.
He skipped a little bit, so I'm just going to go back.
Sports scientist. Sorry.
Abstract from some set of a priori premises pertaining either to what exists or to what can be known. And so it will pay to take a moment to distinguish my pragmatist perspective from the a priori approach endorsed by people like Jonathan Grix and Christy Winters.
Okay. Sorry, Sugar, you were about to say something?
Nope.
Okay. It sounded like you were. I guess something weird happened.
There's
this.
screaming
I'm
angle in the background.
Okay.
I'm going to start by clarifying what exactly I mean by scientific methodology, which I'll do by introducing what I call the Big Four operational criteria, or just Big Four for short. These criteria are the things that I take to be desirable properties of scientific models.
Okay,
They're also the core of my entire...
Yeah.
Okay, so this name is like a bizarre jargon portmanteau. So you've got the Big Four, which is like the Big Four personality traits, and then you've got operational criteria. So an operationalization of something is when you've got some kind of theoretical construct that you want to measure, like, I don't know, aggressiveness. But then you're like, okay, well, how do we measure aggressiveness? And then so you have to come up with some way to directly measure aggressiveness, preferably with some kind of quantitative measure. That would be an operational definition. And I'm looking at this list of things: predictive accuracy, precision. These are like general terms, right? They're not operationalizations.
Yeah, like I was going to say, like, don't these describe what a theory ought to be like? It ought to be precise. It ought to be efficient. It ought to be flexible, and it ought to be coherent per some other scheme. Like,
it ought to be super duper.
Well, they're general norms.
Yeah.
Like they're not. Yeah. They're certainly not operational criteria, right? I mean, there's no. They don't suggest any concrete way to measure.
They're ideals. They aren't criteria.
Well, they're not operationalized, is the point. But anyway,
you could operationalize them, but they describe.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, exactly. Ideal conditions for something.
Yeah, this is the part that I watched. I found this list and I just looked at it. So that's why I kind of have canned things to say here.
Okay, fair enough. Let's keep going.
Entire philosophical program. You'll be hearing me reference them over and over again for the remainder of this series.
No.
The first of these criteria is predictive accuracy and precision, which is pretty self-explanatory. Ceteris paribus, that is, all other things being equal, one model of some set of phenomena is preferable to another such model if it exhibits a superior capacity to predict future data, with superior defined in terms of accuracy and precision. The second of these criteria is explanatory efficiency.
Wait a minute, though. So going back to the dartboard, one of the difficulties I have with some of what he's doing here is that his imagery doesn't always match what he's saying. And so he's making it actually a fairly interesting distinction between precision and accuracy that he's not pursuing afterwards. And so what he's saying is precision is, can you get all of the data points to a certain locus of your own design or of your own intent or whatever? And so the first one is precise, but it's not accurate. So it's like, yes, we can say the data can all, and I don't know what that would mean. I don't know what that would look like necessarily. The second one is accurate insofar as it tracks precision, but is not precise. The third one is just scattershot, literally. And the fourth one is both precise and accurate. this is a hugely important point and a massive aspect of what, naturalistic or scientific inquiry on his view would look like, and he's just skipping over it.
Do you know why he's doing that?
I have no idea.
Because he found this thing on Google. He didn't design this for his talk.
Yeah, but here's the thing: is the first thing about precision but not accurate. It's like if you look at the second dartboard, accuracy is defined by the proximity to the locus or the precise goal, by showing how you can shoot around it in an accurate pattern that accurately tracks it. So then what the hell does the first one mean? I guess he's just not going to analyze this further or use this in any way, which is just so disappointing. But anyway, that's a...
Yeah.
The second of these criteria is explanatory efficiency, which can be thought of as containing two parts. The first of these is the demand that models be made as parsimonious as possible. The number of posits made by the model ought to be as small as reasonably achievable. If two competing models have the same predictive capabilities, but one makes use of fewer theoretical posits than the other, then that model is more efficient by virtue of being able to use less theoretical machinery to achieve the same result.
Exactly.
And is taken...
So stop arbitrarily evoking every branch of philosophy and not adequately differentiating between philosophical methodologies and whole subdisciplines. Anyway. Yeah.
To be more desirable than the less efficient model. The second part of the efficiency criterion is the demand for consilience between models. This is predicated upon the demand that our total model of reality, the entirety of all the webs of inferential relations that constitute our base of knowledge, be synthesized as closely together as possible in order to generate a more robust, more comprehensively interlinked body of knowledge.
Sorry, I don't...
This is pretty old school.
But what the fuck? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's just old school philosophy of science, right?
Yeah, of course it is. He's describing
Inter-theoretical reduction.
Okay, one at a time.
Okay.
Shruggy.
No. That's all I'm saying.
So he's describing a positivist process in which we can kind of either deduce or infer the location of something via its, relational coordinates. But again, he can't be just randomly evoking categories like chemical model, biological model, sociological model, and psychological model all have different structures and data points, but none of this factors into his framework. Like, what is this? Like, I get annoyed by this, right?
Well, the consilience idea is the idea that basically, you've got people studying nature at all these different levels of organization, but what's the relation between these levels?
Precisely.
Well, you could just reduce the top ones to the bottom ones. You just map the top ones onto the bottom ones, and then you'll see how the most basic laws actually give you a basis to predict what will happen at any level of analysis. That's
exactly. So one thing that philosophers like is using our terminology carefully and deliberately, and with the intent of developing an argument from that basis. And so when words are thrown around and kind of levels, how do I put it? We assume from the visual images that a depth of argument is going to be achieved that will never actually be achieved. That gets frustrating because these things all need definition. All of these terms need to be defined.
Right, and we're not being pedantic. Why do they all need definition?
On the basis that it would then help construct from the ground up a careful and complete naturalistic view of the world. Like, how much does biology factor in? How much does chemistry factor in this instance? And so basically when you get a complete picture, you need to know why all the criteria going into the picture are sufficient for making that picture complete. You need to know what would even be happening. You need to start to think about the terminology you're using, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my pleb answer is just because I don't understand what he's saying unless I do that.
Well, it's like let's say you're trying to build an aircraft and it's about to be
you need some wings and like a tail and engines.
It's about to be pushed over a cliff to launch, and you have a super detailed understanding of how you built the airplane and the way it's going to work, except that you actually don't with respect to one particular part, and which has like a bunch of functions that you've sort of encapsulated by just calling it the box. And unfortunately, because you don't actually know how the box works, you don't really know if it's actually going to do the work you need it to do when it goes over the cliff. So that was probably a bad analogy.
Exactly. No, that was perfect.
Let's keep going.
demand stands in opposition to popularly held beliefs concerning the supposed autonomy of certain fields and their alleged immunity to inter-theoretical reduction, as with the supposed irreducibility of sociology to biology. Arguments for why I don't think that societies, minds, and other sacred cows are irreducibly complex lie beyond the scope of this video. For our present purposes, it is sufficient to note that consilient, strongly
Well,
interconnected...
It depends what he means by irreducibly complex. I know that that notion is sometimes implied in some kind of design argument where you're saying that, oh, sorry.
I know, but the thing is, like, the dichotomy is not between irreducible complexity and, like, simple naturalist essentialism. Like, that's what annoys me, right?
Yeah, well, but I mean, so there are views which would say that this consilience ideal is impossible and, you know, not really something you should be trying to get. And it's not because they look at, you know, these higher levels, so to speak, and say that, well, these things would have had, they just would have had to have been created by an intelligent being. Like that's not really the reason why people would kind of argue against this consilience view. It's basically anti-reductionist views are views according to which, you know, there are facts about, say, the organization or the gross system level behavior, which sort of constrain what happens at the lower levels, or they can be independent in some sense. I didn't do a good job of that, but
no, I think you did there's one tangential point that I think is important to make here, which is that even the most naturalistic physicalist is not necessarily somebody who doesn't believe in the concept of a god, bluntly. And so there could be, you know, things don't need to be reduced to their essences necessarily. You can approach this phenomenologically. There's many different ways you can look at it, but none of this necessarily precludes the existence of a creator. So that's, you know, a separate point entirely, but
also true.
Webs of knowledge are preferable to fractured, sparsely connected webs of knowledge, and that this property of consilience contributes to the efficiency of one's total body of knowledge. In summary, then, explanatory efficiency is the demand for parsimony at the level of individual models, and consilience at the level of the total model that emerges from the conjunction of all the other ones. The third criterion is optimal flexibility, which negotiates between two extreme, undesirable properties possessed by bad models. The first of these extremes is the model which is excessively rigid. This is a model which dogmatically maintains its posits about the world, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Such a model is unresponsive to evidence, and is therefore not serviceable towards those functions which scientific models are meant to serve. More on the function of models shortly. The other extreme is the model which is exceedingly flexible. This is a model which incorporates every contradictory piece of evidence into its program by interpreting that evidence in an ad hoc fashion to give off the superficial appearance that the model's predictions have been fulfilled. Such a model is also unresponsive to evidence because there's no conceivable input of observation that will alter the model's theoretical output.
Sorry, what was the first one? What did he say about the first one? Can we just rewatch that? Sorry, audience, if that's annoying. If you followed that. I didn't. Okay.
I followed it, but rewatching is fine because I had a point to make about it. I think he's actually really at his strongest point right now, actually. Like, this is actually really his wheelhouse. But anyway.
So we're at optimal flexibility.
Terrible properties possessed by bad models. The first of these extremes is the model which is excessively rigid. This is a model which dogmatically maintains its posits about the world, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Such a model is unresponsive to evidence, and is therefore not serviceable towards those functions which scientific models are meant to serve. More on the function of models shortly. The other extreme is the model which is exceedingly flexible. This is a model which incorporates every contradictory piece of evidence into its program by interpreting that evidence in an ad hoc fashion to give off the superficial appearance that the model's predictions have been fulfilled.
Okay, but I mean, I don't see how these are opposites. Like he's saying that both of them can just accommodate any evidence. It seems like both of them are too flexible. How is the first one an instance of rigidity?
I think the point is that the rigidity of the first model is used to allow somebody to hold on to a position they want. just through ignoring contrary data. Whereas
Yeah.
this one, by contrast, tries to sort of
That's not a property of a model, though.
So
No,
here's
it's
what I
not. It's
hate
not.
about-
That's why it's sort of it's an ad hom against apologists. Frankly,
I know, and that's what I hate about this. And so I think that, should I just mention what's going on in the background here that makes this really frustrating?
Sure.
So the claim would be much more digestible and you could respond to it much more sufficiently if there wasn't this weird straw manning going on against bluntly his framing of apologists on the one hand and SJWs on the other. Like, that's what he's doing right now, right? And so that's got nothing to do. That's got nothing. And of course, like, it's not SJW to talk about white fragility necessarily. But anyway, so that's got nothing to do with the actual claims being made. And so what he's saying is, he's saying when you have evidence, you want to be not artificially or kind of post hoc motivating it towards some end. I think that's what Shruggy's getting at, is that in both instances, you could be using it spuriously. Like, you could make it overly flexible so that the evidence, you could be essentially bullshitting such that the truth claims are irrelevant. The same evidence could be used to prove the opposite claim, in essence. Or you could be using the evidence to support something that's already been arrived at as an ideological position. You don't want to be doing either of these things, because both these things are spurious uses of evidence, more or less, right?
Right. I just don't see how these are two opposing things. I mean, it kind of sounds like the
They're
thing
not.
he's talking about is a tendency to just accommodate any sort of observation to a theory that you have. But it seems like the same thing. I don't know.
I mean, it's a
understand this.
tendency. It's a tendency that can be mapped according to a spectrum, right? So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with what he's saying here. I think it's just the examples he's using aren't apt. But like you can say, for example, if someone has a tendency to be overly flexible in how they apply their model, or insufficiently flexible in how they apply their model, that seems like just the way it's phrased seems intuitively obvious.
I think post-hawking is an important concept here too, because in both senses, what's happening, you can tell I'm getting tired because it's the 1 hour and 30 minute mark.
Well, we're almost over halfway through, so.
Well, there you go. We made it halfway through. That's a miracle for the three of us, with due respect to everybody. But because we all have so much to say, right? So basically, when you deal with the kind of post-hawking aspect of things, what's happening is you don't want to be using or ushering in evidence to support some kind of claim that is either ideological in nature, therefore can't be proven or disproven, or to kind of support a variety of claims, none of which necessarily centralize around a theme. In other words, you can misuse evidence to either be too flexible or too inflexible, and both kind of smack of ideology. Like, that's how I read that.
Yep.
Okay.
Such a model is also unresponsive to evidence because there's no conceivable input of observation that will alter the model's theoretical output. The name popularly given to the property which characterizes such models is non-falsifiability. A desirable model is one which negotiates between these two extremes and meets the demand for it to be responsive to evidence. It neither blindly ignores nor opportunistically recontextualizes contradictory evidence, and thus refrains from becoming dogma. Such a model responds to contradictory evidence either by recontextualizing its own contents to accommodate new evidence, via the process popularly called paradigm shifting, or by being thrown out altogether.
That was a weird use of Thomas Kuhn, I just want to say that.
I mean, like, wouldn't a paradigm shift be the wholesale adoption of a new model?
Exactly. Like he
said, I object to the term model. I think he means theory, but sure.
Yeah. But I mean, like, the point there, though, is that Thomas Kuhn directly contradicts him. When you're talking about a paradigm shift, you're specifically talking about a shift that doesn't actually follow through from the logic of the previous paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but what you're learning, and so what you're learning from that then is that even the identical evidence is being ushered in to support an opposite or different claim. And so it could be that he would almost attack a Kuhnian paradigm shift as being overly flexible in some senses. And so you see the kind of like Earth-centric versus sun-centric view of the universe, where when you took a look at, astronomers took a look at the coordinates from standing on the face of the Earth at the sky and decided that it didn't make sense. Like, there was something off about it. And then the coordinates only made sense when you looked at like a sun-centric view of the solar system. That would be a Kuhnian paradigm shift, where like even the same evidence is employed to make the opposite or a different claim, and maybe the evidence makes more sense in that new framework. So again, like, it almost seems like he would attack a Kuhnian shift as being too flexible somehow, you know?
Yeah.
Let's keep going.
Okay.
Via the process popularly called falsification. The fourth and final criterion is rational coherence, which is simply the demand that the contents of our models exhibit internal consistency. These big four operational criteria are methodological in their scope. When I speak of methodology as influencing the contents of epistemology and ontology, it is specifically the big four that I am referring to. I claim that the only sorts of things whose existence we're allowed to posit, or our ontology, are those things which issue from models that are compliant with the big four, and that the only things that count as knowledge, aka our epistemology, issue at least in part from models that are, once again, big four compliant. The big four operational criteria are central to my philosophy because they define the limits of ontic and epistemic inquiry, and those limits, as you can see, are drawn by scientific methodology. The big four operational criteria displace the a priori theorizing of armchair ontologists and epistemologists because these criteria don't commit one to any metaphysical presuppositions.
So can I just...
You can make...
So this is a set of a priori norms.
I was just going to say that.
Which he's just sort of given us. And I mean, like, some of them are good things. I mean, coherence, yeah, absolutely. Don't contradict yourself. That's important. Yeah, sure.
But Shruggy, here's the difference. These are science-y.
I mean,
what else are we supposed to say he means by a priori? He means
I don't necessarily want to engage the a priori, a posteriori distinction because I think that might be giving it too much credit, which sounds pretty terrible. But he's saying like a theory ought to be precise, it ought to be efficient, it ought to be optimally flexible, and it ought to be coherent. So these are more sort of normative statements about the structure of a scientific theory than anything else.
I guess, but
I think it's like I don't want to be like deepening.
No,
it, right?
I hear you.
Yeah,
I hear you. It's just at the same time, it's like the pretensions that this video has almost makes it impossible to be like generous in that way, or not. I guess ungenerous in that way. Let's keep going.
Yeah, fair enough. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Make use of the big four without ever having to engage in any a priori theorizing about the world that you're modeling. For example, it makes no difference to me whether the reality that I experience and model is perfectly representative of some noumenal existence, or whether it's all just a delusion. Maybe I'm a brain in a vat. Maybe I'm plugged into the Matrix. Maybe I'm a figment of the imagination of a god, and the universe is just a dream. Maybe I'm God, in that I created the universe in my own mind as part of some delusion that I'm suffering from.
What happened to parsimony? What happened to parsimony?
It's like, girl, we're getting so wild right now. Like, this is like out of the ballpark right now.
Yeah, but he's like, I don't even care. It could be any of these things.
I know. I could be God. Like,
didn't you just tell us that like the only things you're allowed to say exist need to be parsimonious? And now you're like, I don't care which of these things are true.
Look at that visual metaphor of the consciousness trapped behind the eye. Like
grody. I like that. Ugh.
Oh man.
Also, why is that tear duct like outside of the eye?
I don't know. This whole image is something we should not be focusing on, so please spare me. Like, let's move on.
Okay. Yes, let's.
Maybe in reality, I'm stuck in the padded cell of a psychiatric ward, and so I've subconsciously created this world as a coping mechanism to escape my isolation. And you know what? I don't care if any of these scenarios are true. None of these and the many other hypothetical scenarios which have been the subject of endless armchair theorizing and science fiction prompts matter, because none of them have any distinct practical consequences in the world that I experience.
Why is that not a part of his criteria, then? If that's like the reason why he's saying, oh, we don't even care if any of these alternative hypotheses are true, even though I just talked about parsimony mattering.
Yeah, exactly.
The real reason is because it doesn't make a practical difference. It's like, okay, is that your actual criterion? Like,
but his psychologistic framing makes a huge practical difference, because depending on what he believes, he's going to pick out different things for inquiry as having value or not. Like, what the hell? Like, this is, yeah.
I mean, in addition to that, would have the merit of being an actual criteria or criterion.
That was just quite a, quite a
It's a
shift.
trip, man.
I have whiplash, but yeah.
Posit anything in an a priori fashion about the nature of reality in order to be able to function.
Hang on, wait a sec.
Posit any
Oh no.
I
of this
did he just
world as
do
a
it?
coping
Hang on.
mechanism to escape my isolation. And you know what? I don't care if any of these scenarios are true. None of these and the many other hypothetical scenarios which have been the subject of endless armchair theorizing and science fiction prompts matter, because none of them have any distinct practical consequences in the world that I experience. I don't need to posit anything in an a priori fashion about the nature of reality in order to be able to function. All that I need is the ability to exercise decision-making power in the world that I perceive.
Okay, how does he determine this?
Wait a minute. This is just affronting my very dignity right now.
Sorry.
Can't deal with this. Like, this is way too late in the stream to be doing this. But no, Peirce is not evidence for this. Like, all Peirce is talking about there is the way in which we can understand the world via the causal effects as we perceive them. It doesn't mean that what goes into that inquiry initially doesn't matter. It just means that that's what shapes our perception of reality. Like, that's not what Peirce is saying. This is like being ushered in the worst way possible.
By the way,
let's talk about what Kant's saying, though. Why is this? How is this a
Everything is
move
so
away
wrong.
from a priori reasoning?
I know. Like, I don't even want to evoke that because it's just not. It's not worthy of that. Like,
It's funny. Sorry, Shruggy, what were you going to say?
well, by the way, I love this quote. I think it is like a good psychological idea, actually.
it's not.
And William James says something similar. I mean, this is a common pragmatist kind of principle.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
It's like, okay, so like, what does a concept amount to? Well, think of all the different ways it would affect, your actual conduct, your actual behavior. Let's talk about beliefs. Like, what does a belief amount to? Well, think about all the possible ways that having that belief would change what you do, change what you attend to, change how you orient yourself in the world.
Absolutely. And then if you decide that how you're acting on that basis is spurious and the whole conception of the object you have based on its causal effect in the world is problematic, then you go back and ask new questions on that basis and you refine and you refine. That's actually sort of the sophisticated version of his initial looping effect thesis that was more like a weird spiral, right?
That's good. That takes it a step further than I was going.
Shall we continue?
Sure.
Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah.
10 minutes.
Regardless of whatever the capital T true nature of that world happens to be.
Ugh.
Before I go on, it's crucial that you understand that when I speak of models which satisfy the Big Four operational criteria, I'm not just talking about the kinds of models that you'll find inside of a science textbook. I'm talking about the models that you are constantly generating every time the mental processes which compose your mind engage with sense data and organize them.
Look at that.
Every
left right
second of
brain.
every day, the photoreceptors in your eyes, olfactory receptors in your nose,
Oh,
gustatory
no.
receptors on your tongue.
Oh
Shruggy,
no.
Shruggy, are you okay?
Yeah.
I'm not okay.
So I mean, this is predicated on a false cognitive theory. But anyways, continue.
Well, it's also predicated. So again, like, this is something that I just want to get very clear on. Peirce is not a sensationalist, by the way. And so what can be ushered in as data to be brought to bear on the kinds of doubts we have, to erase those doubts and fix belief as the object of inquiry, can be non-literal and not based on what we can perceive on the basis of the senses. Like, this whole sensorial turn, this like physicalist turn towards what we can see by the five senses, is not what's going on there in pragmaticism, according to Peirce. Like, that's just not what's happening.
Hey, Shruggy, if you're tired, no worries, but do you have it in you to explain what's wrong with this?
Well, my problem with it rests on my adopting. I think so. Okay, I subscribe to a different theory of mind, a different theory of perception than the one that's being articulated right now. I don't know how he's going to use it. He hasn't even finished saying what it is yet. I don't know if you want to talk about Gibson and ecological psychology right now, but probably
We probably don't
not.
have time, but we should probably, I imagine this is going to come up in the next video, so we should probably hold on to that for next week or whenever we do that. But yeah, Let's keep
Yeah,
going.
let's.
We've been going for an hour and a half. Let's keep going.
Auditory and vestibular receptors in your ears, and somatosensory receptors throughout your body are bombarded with sense data that your brain subsequently organizes into a model of your external environment. The Big Four simply impose constraints on the types of models that can properly be counted as knowledge, and whose contents include all the things that can properly be said to exist. I observe that sense data is being presented to my mental faculties. My mental processes take that data and use it to create models of the world. Is that world real, or is it made up? Are the models that I create representational of something external to myself, or are they just delusion? Again, I don't care. All that matters is that, as far as I can tell, the world that I observe appears to exhibit regularities, and those regularities appear to come with consequences.
Okay, I'll say
Things
something.
that fall from great...
Yes.
So what the audience needs to understand is that what he just articulated, that is a sense data theory of perception. And that is just one of many sort of live options that are out there. And in fact, it's kind of a dated one. It's one that's kind of been falling from popularity. So, he
Well,
kind of just says that's how it is. But
yeah,
you need to know that
it's dated back to the rational enlightenment, right? In terms of sort of like a thin version of Humeanism or something like that. And I completely agree with you. Like, it's completely been removed from the popular consciousness and replaced by much more subtle and complex views of reality and what we can perceive and what we can understand about reality. So again, like, it's a lot of thin physicalist views, though, are actually informed centrally by this like sense-based notion of perception. So yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to, make it clear that this is not an uncontentious thing. This is actually one among many views, and
So
kind
what
of
is-
an increasingly discredited one.
What is the critical point on which it's being discredited?
Depends who's discrediting it. It depends who the interlocutor is. But I mean, so okay. So one feature of this view is it's like, okay, so here's a question. What do you see? Like, do you see like the computer you're looking at? Do you see the objects on your desk? Or do you see something you can call sense data, some mental picture of those things? Is that the object of perception? So the views that say that, no, what you see is some picture or representation, which is kind of, it's in your mind, right? Those are sense data views. Those are the views he just articulated. And a lot of people are going to basically deny that.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
Heights tend to experience lots of force upon making contact with the ground, and that's a consequence that might be worth taking notice of. Touching hot objects tends to cause painful burning sensations when handled without protection, and that's a consequence that might be worth taking notice of. Bills that get unpaid result in very rude letters being sent to one's mailbox, followed soon after by a visit from some highly unpleasant people.
Wait a minute. So any surface reading of Searle would help erase the equivocation between somebody sending someone to give you letters for being in arrears versus fire being hot to the touch, right? So one is like the causal effect of some kind of natural phenomena versus the set of social institutions and constructions that lead one to being in arrears using the symbolic thing that is money, right? So again, like, to reduce those two types of things to the same process is to kind of dismiss the complexity of social institutions and everything that's going into our reading of these things to begin with. So it's kind of frustrating to see that.
Also, you pay your taxes because you learn what it means when you don't pay taxes. You don't actually have to have the person come to your house, in order to learn that.
But to act like it's a causal effect situation in a deterministic sense where there's non-agential actors involved is bizarre. Like, it's not, one is causal effect. The other one is, these are the systems that are in place such that if you engage with society in this way, this is likely to happen using this symbolic thing, money, right? So it's just different in terms of what's being operationalized, right? Do we want to quit soon and switch to questions? Just curious.
Let's just finish this, And I
see
think
questions.
there's like 4 minutes left, and then we'll go to questions for a few minutes. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay,
Yeah.
I can survive 4 minutes.
Yeah.
FBI, open up!
That's a
Good God. Okay.
consequence that might be worth taking
No, I didn't mean
notice
that
of.
way.
In the end, the models that I develop of the world that I perceive, and the regularities that the world appears to exhibit, seem to come with consequences that I should take stock of if I'd like to be able to exert some level of control over my environment, regardless of whether that environment is real or imaginary. The entire reason why I hold beliefs in the first place, why I generate models of the world, is so that I can at some point translate those models into actions. The Big Four operational criteria, then, don't issue from some a priori notion of what exists or what can be known, but rather stem from pragmatic considerations pertaining to my ability to navigate the world. The first criterion is simply the demand that my models have discernible consequences. They must exhibit applicability. If they're not applicable to my ability to navigate the world, then they are literally of no use to me. The second criterion is the demand that my models are efficient, that the computational activities which characterize my mental processes don't get bogged down with unnecessary posits. My ability to process sense data is limited, and allocating valuable space and processing power to useless features in my models is a waste of mental energy that might have been better applied towards something else. The third criterion is the demand that my models are accountable to my senses.
Which
If
he'll
I'm
never
trying to model the
justify.
world in a manner
Sorry.
that allows me to
Sorry. Go on.
I mean, that little story he said about how, well, your nervous system's only got so many resources it's got to allocate. If you believe unparsimonious things, that's just gonna tax your computational resources. Like, that's a cute little story. I don't know. Like,
It's
anyway,
terrible. It actually predisposes people to ideological belief systems, which, yeah, it's awful.
Just
Well,
for clarification,
you're never
so-
gonna see that mechanism explained, like, because
Yeah.
it's not, and nobody really, because that's not a thing cognitive scientists have ever located. This kind of, people will posit it as an explanation, but it's not. It's a hypothetical explanation. But anyways, I'm showing my hand on some more interesting debates here. Let's just continue.
navigate it effectively, taking on dogmas can be deleterious to that task. This criterion allows me to identify and dismiss dogmas from my thought process, thus freeing my models of the world, to the best of my ability, from the hazards associated with pretending to know things that I do not in fact know. The fourth and final criterion is the demand that my models are internally consistent, as contradictions can paralyze my ability to make important decisions. These are the pragmatic justifications that I offer for making the Big Four operational criteria the core of my entire philosophical program, and, as we shall see, the fissile core of the Naturalist Nuke. With this methodological groundwork, I can now evaluate philosophical investigations in terms of their practical benefits, instead of just sitting in an armchair and dreaming up cute little word games. But of course, there will still be those who aren't sold on this program. There will still be those who, for whatever reason, want to speculate about abstract philosophical foundations prior to considering any practical consequences.
Well, you were all sitting in your dorm studying philosophy. I studied the blade.
And
Okay.
Yeah.
to those philosophers who insist on debating endlessly about the number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin, I wish you all the happiness in the world, and may your armchairs never break.
Idiots.
To everybody else, that is, everybody
Jerks.
who's interested in organizing their beliefs in a manner that is geared, from the outset, towards the actualization of controllable outcomes in the world, keep watching, because at this point, the social constructionist is likely ripping her hair out and banging her head against the desk.
Oh, it's a female, all right.
Do you want to be one of those stupid idiots, or do you want to do science and math
know,
and pixel art?
Look,
Cool
look,
kids.
Minion Nose Doctor wrote the most hilarious thing. Ah, yes, Crocoduck's flaming nuclear katana. It's just, Ooh. All right.
Okay, we got like 2 minutes, guys. Let's plow through.
Okay, I'll try.
I can almost hear Christie and her fellow social constructionists, even now as I say these words. King Crocoduck, they must be shouting. This entire time, you have been using normative, value-laden language to characterize the core of your philosophical program. And indeed I have. I have been talking this entire time about desirable properties of superior models, about good science and bad inferences. I am invoking the language of value judgments in the establishment of my pragmatic, naturalistic perspective. These normative value judgments, then, which belong to the philosophical field of axiology, are being situated prior to methodology. The methods that I have based my worldview on are themselves based on certain values. So even if I take methodology, which I've characterized in terms of the Big Four, to be the proper basis of ontic and epistemic inquiry, that basis is itself situated within a prescriptive, normative foundation. And value judgments, the social constructionist will triumphantly inform me, are subjective. Values are social constructs. Therefore, even under my pragmatic and naturalistic program, science is still, fundamentally, a social construct. And it would seem, at first glance, that I have lost the argument.
Yeah,
How can I possibly deny that I'm making value judgments regarding what counts as good or bad science, good or bad philosophy? How can I possibly contest the claim that my philosophy of science has a normative basis?
Okay, what do you think he's going to say?
I know I'm curious, though, but I have a feeling it's going to be a complete misreading of pragmatism. But anyway, let's go.
Shruggy, any bets?
All bets are off at this point. Let's just come along
And
for the ride.
indeed, I cannot deny these things. I must confess that axiology does indeed inform my methodology. I do make value judgments about what makes a good model versus a bad model. And in acknowledging this, it would appear, at least initially, that I have conceded the argument, and that science is, in fact, a social construct. How couldn't it be? If the normative values that inform the Big Four operational criteria are socially constructed, as we understand normative values generally to be, then the Big Four operational criteria that are informed by those values are socially constructed, and by extension, so are the scientific models that the Big Four characterize. Unless I do something radical, like try to argue that these normative values are themselves non-social in origin, I'm toast, and surely I'm not crazy and naive enough to try to derive an ought from an is, am I? That would be like trying to argue that the rules of poker or traffic laws come from nature and not from human societies. I mean, it would be insane to try to argue that the Big Four operational criteria can be found in nature, right? They're so evidently man-made, no different from the Ten Commandments or the Magna Carta. Surely I won't try to argue that the Big Four operational criteria came from nature, so there's no way I'd try to pull the same trick with axiology that I did with epistemology and ontology, and try to situate the value-oriented justifications for the Big Four within a naturalized methodology, right? Perhaps I'd better just concede that science is a social construct and move on with my life.
Get to the point.
Oh, man.
I mean, come on.
Again,
I'm not going to try to
wait.
argue that the normative
can I just-
values...
No, he's about to get to it. He has
I know,
seconds
but
left.
he's already defeated himself out the gate. But anyway, just
Yeah, but no, he's going to surprise us. He has a plan.
I know, but his plan implies that the major contention is that his system is naturalistic when
Listen,
it's not. But anyway, that's fine.
Listen, we've spent almost 2 hours going through this Rube Goldberg machine. Let's just let it.
Fine. Hate it.
Okay, his machinations are beyond your comprehension.
Oh man.
In the next 30 seconds, like how much time do we have left? Like a minute? He's going to just destroy you. So just get ready for it.
All right, I'm ready.
No, you're not.
which underlie the Big Four operational criteria are themselves natural. Am I? Am I? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Enter the Naturalist Nuke.
Please, God, no. Like,
Wait,
oh, God.
wait, is he not going to do it?
I don't think
is he
he's going to do it.
Is he just ending?
Wait, no.
Wait a
It
minute.
ends on a cliffhanger.
It was a cliffhanger.
Oh my God.
Oh, God, no. So anyway,
We
here's
were
the
here
problem,
for
like,
2 hours.
I feel almost embarrassed in making this point, and I'm exhausted at this point, but here's the point that I'm going to make. Whether or not any of these criteria may be found in how nature adjudicates itself or the way in which we can determine on naturalistic processes is irrelevant, because there's a degree of arbitrariness with which we're selecting these phenomena. And again, the whole point is that there are looping effects that are occurring, and it's not just like social processes going in on one distal end and science being spat out on the other. I don't need to agree with Christy in any significant sense in order to make that point. So
I just want to say that I admire the sheer balls that at the end of this, I guess for him it was 20 minutes, but at the end of, I guess it was 27 minutes, at the end of this half-hour long argument, the argument is actually just, I have a nuke. And he just shows a picture of a nuke, and that's all there is.
well, you know what that means. We have to come back for round 2. Because he is in fact an anime villain. So this is a JoJo thing.
2 points. I mean, like, first, the social is part of the natural world, right? So if something is socially conditioned, you can say it's part of the natural world, and it is, and it's socially conditioned, right?
I think it'd be more freaky. Peirce allows for there to be supernatural phenomena in potentia that may actually influence the criteria that go into how we develop doubts that we need to then erase. Like, he actually potentially allows for this under his phenomenology. Just noting that.
Yeah. But
the second thing, which is... Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, finish your point, Shruggy.
Well, the second thing, which is like even more, I don't know, damning or something, is that, every single step on that little diagram that he draws is a kind of socially conditioned activity, right? Like it's not just the source of his values, the things that he's his criteria, his desiderata for a theory, or he calls them models. That's going to be socially conditioned, but then also every other step of the scientific process or coming up with more methodology, that's going to be, all of these things are socially conditioned affairs. I mean, if you're learning from books that other people have written, I mean, that's a socially conditioned affair.
But what I think is almost to even like reify that point further, what's relevant in this is that the questions we ask are the questions that are relevant for us. And in the process of asking them and answering them and working them through, we develop new doubts and new questions. And there's a kind of like a recursive process that develops in that. And there's this kind of bizarre, strange, naturalistic physicalism he associates with like the male pursuit of physics and hard sciences versus this like SJW figure that he imagines screaming about how values inform the process on one distal end, that is just like a false dichotomy and a strange reductivist lens on much of the important work done by philosophers of science like Quine and like all these other people. And so it's, again, like the train of thought that he's drawing through philosophy of science, assuming that it's all sort of simplistically naturalistic or kind of is determining on things via their causal relations in this kind of post-positive sense. And there's not like nuance and complexity from Hume onwards is also ludicrous. Like it's that he's so good at almost getting there, but he would have to get rid of the ideological baggage associated with coming from a certain political vantage in order to do that. And that's the problem with a lot of physicists that I found. So I feel like he's so close to getting into that middle territory that has nothing to do with this bifurcated set of views,
Okay, so I see one question here, and then we both have been here for a long time, and I know that especially Shruggy's, it's very late for him. So we'll just ask that, and then I think we'll call it. And I think next time what we'll do is we'll be assiduous about not stopping as much because it's longer, and we'll have a longer question period after that, which will be a good time to do that because then we'll have the naturalist nuke itself. All we have now is the core.
We'll survive
now is the core and the shadow of the missile descending upon us. So,
well, I feel like after enduring that, we could probably answer a few questions.
Like 15 minutes. Let's do that. Yeah. So for people in the audience, if you have a question, what I ask is that unless you're doing a super chat, in which case thank you, but we don't require that at all. Put an asterisk at the beginning of your question and at the end so that we can identify it quickly while scrolling through as a question. You guys can see the chat from the window here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to disappear for like 5 seconds. If you guys just want to like answer questions as they pop up, feel free.
Okay.
I believe Sean Croft has one already.
No,
there's what I saw from Raw Coco. I want to.
Maybe he does, yeah.
Oh yeah, and there's one from Raw Coco as well.
I wonder who these people are. Okay. Why is direct realism, particularly in the contemporary flat earther? Jeez. But also with how stream. Okay, well, that's just like a random, unrelated question, although it's important in its own sense.
Where is this?
I don't know, Shruggy, do you want to like take it away from here? So one of the questions that kind of comes up that I think Rococo was asking was like, why are we even bothering? And that's a question for us, but that's also a question for Sunday. And so I kind of feel like I wish he was here during the process of asking that question. So let's try to ask it different, because I think that he would have a lot to say on that topic and about public philosophy and outreach and that kind of thing. So let's try to find another question that relates directly. I mean, I think there's a lot of good discussion that's occurred. Okay, do you think King Crocoduck should just go back to debunking young Earth creationists?
I think this is like an unsuccessful offshoot of that. Like, that's kind of probably what this person got good at. They got good at sort of this sort of debunk genre from like, I don't know, 12 or 15 years ago or whatever it is now. Gosh, when was that? Early YouTube, like the only people who were like tech savvy enough and had enough time were, I don't know, that's kind of what was cool to do. You kind of, I don't know, lambast stupid people.
Yeah, and I mean, like,
that was in quotes. Yeah.
Fair enough, but I think that also when we're getting into this kind of like rhetoric, there's a huge issue of like, what's the limits of expertise and kind of what sort of arguments are we allowed or able to make from what disciplinary standpoints. And I think that as much as we've been kind of like having a time of it with this and in general, that King Crocoduck is speaking from a disciplinary standpoint and is speaking out of frustration at a lot of philosophers and other humanists and people who don't really understand what goes into the scientific process and what goes into actually engaging the process of inquiry in real time in relation to actual empirical data, and developing sort of positions from hypotheses or questions that have to be answered. And so I think we should expect that we should allow people to move outside of their kind of focus or disciplinary expertise on the one hand. But on the other hand, I don't think we should allow people to make spurious claims about other disciplines. And I think that a huge issue that Sunday kept bringing up was that of like disciplinary chauvinism, right? And obviously you and I know full well that especially in like analytic philosophy circles, there's a lot of that going on from our end too, even between analytics and continentals, for instance, even though that divide doesn't really apply anymore. So I think there's a more interesting question that emerges, like, and again, like from that question that is about kind of the limits of expertise and what people can actually talk about, right? So maybe he shouldn't go back to doing that. Maybe he should be debating us. Maybe we should be having this big discussion with him. You know what I mean? Like, I kind of feel like he should be allowed to do what he kind of wants to do.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's a free country, probably, wherever he is.
But I mean, I also feel like if he pushes the boundaries of his knowledge base and where he's at, that could also be a productive activity that we shouldn't necessarily be shunning or something like that, right? Sunday, are you back?
I am.
So
what were we
here's
answering?
a question for you that I actually want to put forward from Rococo. Why are we engaging people who aren't, let's say, academic philosophers? Why are we doing this type of work instead?
Well, there's three very serious reasons. The first very serious reason is that these people are spreading a huge amount of disinformation about philosophy of science, even just about science. And by going through these videos, we can correct some of those things and actually explain some of the stuff they touch on, hopefully better. That's one. Second is, again, like this is sort of a vehicle to explain topics that are important to us. And it's just easier if you already have like, again, like a line on the board to start drawing off of that than just like make like a long video essay concerning all of these things starting from the ground up. It's much easier to start from false presuppositions or bad arguments and correct them than to just go from start at ground zero. So there's a pragmatic, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a practical reason why that particular kind of thing is useful for the kind of content that we're trying to produce. And then the last thing is that it's funny. So, and that's about it.
Well, and also the thing is that, like, how do I describe this? Like, we're not trying to humiliate or denigrate the actual person themselves. And we understand this person has like wild amounts of expertise in discipline that we know nothing of, right?
Oh,
and
absolutely.
so I think we're also trying to get at, and what I was talking to Shruggy about earlier, was how disciplinary chauvinism or kind of academic chauvinism occurs. And truly, the marker of somebody who actually has expertise or ability in an area is the ability to translate out that expertise. And then people in the public sphere may have meaningful and important and necessary things to contribute to that expertise. Like, the expert is not infallible. and the public is not necessarily ignorant, and there should be dialogue between the two groups, because otherwise what's the effing point to some extent, right? That's why you do public outreach.
Yeah. On that note, I would like to point out, and I don't know for sure if this is actually the case because I haven't checked what her credentials are, but Christy Winters, the person he's responding to, is a political scientist, not a professional philosopher as far as I'm aware. Generally, philosophers don't botch, for example, the use of concepts like social construction as badly as political scientists do, or people who are engaged specifically in political rhetoric, wherein the use of social construction, the invocation of that term, is not to explain the ontological reality of a thing or its roots in society as like an explanation for what constitutes it in time. The use of it is to say this thing doesn't matter or isn't real. And that's not the upshot of saying that something is a social construction. Now, if somebody is using the supposed naturalness of a thing to commend it, let's say traditional gender roles or something, and there is toxic elements associated with that, well, the fact that it's a social construction opens up the door to changing them. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that they are less real, or for that fact.
Yeah, and that's the important part, is that like gender is non-arbitrary, right? And so over a lifetime of looping and relational associations, and yes, natural aspects, and sort of, how would you describe it, like phenotypical aspects, or kind of like genetic aspects, like things develop in certain ways or to certain ends. This is all something that kind of happens in a complex, intricate back and forth feedback loop sort of process that would require conscious effort to shift away from more toxic and problematic norms. That is possible, and it is possible to be resistive. And anytime, and this is, see, the question around gender relates to the question around determinism fundamentally, right? Because if we are able to look at something that ought to be deterministic and instead find a compatibilist theory, so for instance, like that everything is causal effect, but we have an ability to resist that and work with it and understand it and manipulate it away from where it was if the results are horrible and problematic. And that doesn't necessarily deny the existence of there being actual facts of the matter or things that have developed in a relational form. What it does deny is that process is utterly inevitable. And part of the process of social construction is to say these things we think are inevitable are actually highly evitable, as well as being real. So bacteria are real, but they're evitable, not inevitable, based on our understanding of them as a specific type of pathogen that we can treat. Yeah. So it's like, so this is where you get into these complex kind of social metaphysics of gender. And this is a legitimate and serious and important area of philosophical inquiry that just gets so ideologically dismissed that we don't actually see what's at stake in it. And so the misunderstanding around social construction is probably one of the most dire misunderstandings in contemporary philosophy. Anyway, that's like all I'll say.
Okay, great. Here's just a less sophisticated point, but I think is also really important. I think a major reason why people like King Crocoduck are so hell-bent against concepts like social construction is because, frankly, a lot of the people who've been promoting the use of that terminology in public discourse have been incredibly abusive towards people like King Crocoduck.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think it's his fault that he has a negative perception of people who do that. They were awful. There's a reason why I come out of that milieu. Like, people have been really, really awful to people from this position. So like he's doing a very bad job. He's being extremely arrogant and belligerent, and he doesn't know what he's talking about a solid 50% of the time with respect to this topic. But he seriously knows what he's talking about the other 50% of the time, and bluntly, he's been on the receiving end of certain forms of abuse potentially. So the other thing too is, like, you realize a lot of social constructionists are actually traditionalists because they understand the importance of things that are developed relationally in context, the kind of realness of that supersedes anybody's ability to continue it, right? So I think one of the best things we could ever do is get away from a left-right ideological lens as it pertains to a lot of these topics. Like, I really think that's one of the best things we could do. Well, especially certainly if you're arguing with somebody who from your interactions with them, let's say King Crocoduck in this case, is ignorant. Well, then you're dealing with someone who is ignorant. Like, to the extent that the person is willing to engage with you, you should be treating them as somebody you're trying to teach something to, not someone you're trying to destroy.
But also in relation to that, I think that we should also never assume that our interlocutor doesn't actually have some important or central point to make about something, that they have nothing to teach us, in short, because we're also ignorant about things that they're knowledgeable on. And I just wish that there was a greater degree of critical analysis and thought in relation to that. But unfortunately, that's not what sells, and that's not what creates views. Right?
That's the saddest thing about like the insecurity about his department that's been coming through, and it's of course in the context of debating with people who say that you can't address subjects of philosophical importance because you're not formally a philosopher. And that seems to be sort of what he's kicking back with when he refers to what was his Grick? Was it Grick who was the sporticist, the sports theorist? The sporticist.
I know exactly what you referenced there, and I'm like ashamed of you, but it's okay.
I'm sorry. I tried to cover it up and pretend I made a gap, but yes,
it's okay. It's late COVID. We're allowed to do what we want. You know, at this point, it's all bets are off. It's 2 hours in.
I mean, like he is what would have been called once upon a time a natural philosopher. Exactly. He has a highly technical specialization that, relative to our powers in that area, is a superpower. He has absolutely no reason to be insecure about not necessarily having, like, I don't know. The whole idea that science being a social construction somehow delegitimates science or makes it subordinate to philosophers is ridiculous to me.
It is ridiculous. There's a question that Sean Croft is asking that's like way beyond my like energy levels this far into the stream because I'm old, goddammit. But basically the question is like, in what ways do conservative versus radical readings of Peirce impact inquiry? Which is like the biggest kind of guiding question of everything I've ever done. So I feel like I should probably address that elsewhere. If that dichotomy even makes sense, yes, it does, because it impacts kind of how he gets taken up into different contexts. It seems evident different assumptions get brought into how people view pragmatism. So I think that kind of gets to the heart. Like I'm not gonna be able to address this adequately right now. Like there's just no way. But the heart of that actually matters for this is that the notion that something that is meant to be about the erasure of doubt in context by pursuing a line of inquiry from something that troubles us could take on an ideological form of one form or another is really spurious and creepy. But in many ways, Peirce has been used as a conservative figure because of this notion of him as being pro-science, right? Of being sort of like pro-methodology, all the things that King Crocoduck is getting into. However, the truth of the matter is Peirce is absolutely apolitical in this one sense. He is simply making a point about whatever it is that we place normative value on, we can pursue. And those objects of inquiry can be the most socially elevated to the most base physicalist, whatever, right? Or they can be most base physical to most, most base social to the most physicalist elevated, whatever way you want to put it. But regardless, he's not making a kind of an ideological set of claims. So it's weird. It's just really weird that as a so-called scientific thinker, he gets taken to be conservative. That's all I'll say on that.
This is, we'll do this last question just because I'm exhausted. I want to eat. I don't care anymore if Shruggy's tired. Now it's about me. So, let's see. Okay. I guess it's just a question about the other video. So, are you aware King Crocoduck talked to? Oh, okay. This is different. Are you aware King Crocoduck talked to Steve Shives, who at the time thought that social constructionism is linked with cultural Marxism, hence why he calls constructionism of science the new Lysenkoism?
Ooh, what the hell? Sorry.
I mean, Steve Shives. Wait, was this Steve Shives who thought that? No, it would have been Steve Shives. Steve Shives is a leftist.
So what's Lysenkoism?
I don't know off the top of my head. Let me Google it. I actually came across that word earlier today. I just lost it. I think it's being misspelled here anyway. So.
No, but I mean, like the question's a fair question, and like it's
it is. I just want to know what it is.
It has more energy than we do right now. It's a political campaign led by Trofim Lysenko against genetics and science-based agriculture in the mid-20th century, rejecting natural selection in favor of Lamarckism and exaggerated claims to the benefits of vernalization and grafting. Okay, so it's just he's calling it a pseudoscience, basically. Yeah.
Okay. That doesn't surprise me. I mean, that's basically what he's been arguing for here, right? So, it doesn't surprise me either. Again, like with respect to the association with cultural Marxism, quote unquote, because cultural Marxism is used largely as a catch-all for anything that can be treated as if it's being deployed in bad faith to further a quote unquote leftist / Marxist / social what have you movement. Unfortunately, what you actually realize when you actually go through academia yourself is that this doesn't exist, and in fact, even Marxism is not really held in high esteem. Like,
and in
really
fact, a lot of what we attribute to bad faith Marxist thinking is in fact bad faith neoliberal thinking. But anyway.
In fact, weirdly, philosophy departments can often be very, very, very conservative. They're just quiet about it.
Oh, absolutely. Philosophy is a basically conservative discipline, which is, anyway.
Yeah.
Relatively, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, political science can be too. It depends on where you are. I think in political science, Marx gets a bit more credit than he does in almost every other department. I don't think he's actually studied anywhere else outside of things like cultural studies courses or things like that, which can be solid or terrible depending on who's teaching them. But that association is sort of par for the course with these people. And again, like it's not hard to understand why. Like when you have like the people who talk to the kinds of people who you're most likely to interact with, especially in like 2016, who are going to be using this language in common parlance, are not going to be people using this language carefully or who are like talking to non-specialists. They're people who are going to be deploying fancy language they picked up through osmosis in order to batter people in the public sphere.
And it's sad because the fancy language tracks back to things like, what is being? What is the nature of reality? What does it mean to know something?
Yeah.
Like, these are questions we can talk about and people ought to have access to, not to be able to answer. Can I do like a nerdy thing for a second and just like look at one thing that Minion
What do you think we've been doing for the past 2 hours?
But nerdy in the sense of like, this doesn't relate back to the overall theme of this. It might be a little bit like,
we need a cleanser.
Peirce is sort of like an insurrectionary anarchist when it comes to inquiry. One thing I want to say about this is that that's not for no reason. Peirce was absolutely marginalized and ostracized from the academy and denied any quotes legitimate academic position of tenure. And of course, like, he came from the kind of family that allowed him to become educated in a certain mode. So we're not saying that he's just like this absolutely abject figure. Although many people are saying that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's conception of inferential reasoning, which they believe he got from Russell, is actually from Peirce. That's kind of cool. He's like a Sherlock Holmes figure. But more or less, he's absolutely fed up with what he sees as an academic tendency towards regurgitating sources of knowledge that are based in kind of either deductive mathematical reasoning or are based in kind of like historicization of trends. Like, in other words, like, people just sit around drinking port and talking about things that they know, as opposed to people who are actually interested in critical thinking. And so he had almost like
they don't drink port.
Radical view of philosophy insofar as philosophy was the process of engaging in critical thinking itself, as opposed to regurgitating knowledge that was previously given to us. And the reason this mattered is because he was actually one of the first people to come up with the notion of academic tenure, which protected professors and intellectuals from being fired on the basis of coming up with novel and interesting but contentious thought. So in terms of him being like this kind of weird reactionary figure, that's absolutely accurate. And it came from him being marginalized, which is actually really interesting. Anyway, that's just like in response to that question or that comment. That's a cool side point.
So it's his fault.
It might be, but then of course, like, the classic point of like, it all becomes ideology in the end also obtains, right?
All
so
right.
anyway, it's a cool thing.
So I didn't really get to address the question about
oh, sure.
why is it worthwhile to address with these, we have a panel of people who are studying this stuff, and why are we addressing these videos of people who do not study this stuff and picking, like nitpicking their stuff. There is, I will confess, a kind of curmudgeonly impulse that these people are misrepresenting the stuff I know.
Yep.
And it's annoying because they're doing it very confidently, and they're portraying a lot of things as though they were the consensus view, and they're misleading a lot of people in the process. So one is, we want to correct the ways in which these videos are misleading people, but another one is at the same time you have this misleading, you have this kind of again this ad hominem sort of. I don't know. It's
they're disparaging like real solid work.
See, here's what I hate too, is that
this is what's going to get you stuck.
Let's Shruggy go.
Okay.
This is what's going to get you stuck in these inadequate views is smugness. What they're doing is they're making you smug, right? So you're listening to what they're saying, and all these other views are just obviously stupid, and what they're doing is they're beating their smugness into you. So if I could just, disarm some of that stuff and kind of just deflate it a bit, I feel like I'm doing something good.
There's a really good article on how Neil deGrasse Tyson makes science boring, which you should all look up because it's tremendously funny. But yeah. And last question. It's not a question, just a clarification. Marx is semi-tolerated in some sociology fields, which is partially why Vosh has left us. Yeah, I left out sociology. Sociology treats Marx with his due respect and often invokes him directly. I think more so, what they more so do is they just, Marx is, if nothing else, an extremely critical historian. And one of the things that Marxist historians are known for is being extremely good at meticulously citing the material causes of what they're arguing. So, anyways. Oh, and one last question. So this is from Seven Hake. Question I have is, I know about bad takes of philosophy by scientists, but what about bad takes of science by philosophers? Do any notable examples exist? Yes.
A ton.
Yes.
Oh, God.
Oh, God. Think about things Foucault has said, primarily right now, if I'm being honest.
I think Paul Virilio was actually cited in the Sokal thing, in the Sokal affair. I don't know what the book was called, but he apparently got the what did he get wrong? Was it what's the word? Shoot, I'm so tired. It begins with a V.
Verificationism?
No, it has to do with speed. I just lost the word.
Velocity.
Thank you. Velocity.
Yeah.
That's it. Oh my God. Yeah.
It's time to call it at 2 hours and 20 minutes. We're
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
yeah. Let's do it.
So thank you, Shruggy and Jalma, for enduring this with me.
My pleasure.
It was fun.
Thanks as well to the audience. And before I forget, thank you, Fake Name, for the kind $10 donation. And all of you have a good night and take care. And I dread the next time we do this because, oh God.
Well, enjoy your lives.
While you can.
Exactly.
Take care.